There are stories that seem to belong only to scripture or myth, yet across centuries they continue to echo through the journals of explorers, the voices of native traditions, and the silent traces buried beneath the earth. The hypothesis we are about to enter is not a dry academic theory, but a stream of hidden history. The existence of giants in the Americas, beings described as twice the height of ordinary men, with red hair, heavy beards, and footprints so large they stunned entire crews of sailors. From Magellan's encounters in Patagonia to the Paiute legends of Nevada, from the vast burial mounds of Ohio to caves sealed by fire in Lovelock, every fragment suggests the image of a race that once walked beside us and then disappeared into the mist of time. Alongside these fragments rises an even greater enigma. Were the proofs of their existence simply forgotten? Or were they deliberately concealed? This is not only a journey into the mystery of giants, but also into the question of memory itself, of what truths humanity is allowed to preserve, and which ones are buried. Welcome to Historic Sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. When the first European sails cut across the western horizon, the New World was imagined as a place of endless wonders. But few could have predicted that the greatest wonder would not be its rivers, mountains, or golden cities, but the people who were said to tower over ordinary men. Ferdinand Magellan, the Portuguese captain determined to prove that one could reach the riches of Asia by sailing west, found more than storms and hunger on his journey. As his crew anchored on the cold shores of what is now Argentina, they recorded a sight that would never leave the imagination of those who survived. Antonio Pigafetta, the Venetian chronicler who faithfully wrote down every detail, described a man who appeared on the shore, naked, singing, dancing, and throwing dust over his head in a ritual act that seemed both playful and sacred. The crew approached him cautiously, imitating his gestures as a sign of peace. When the giant finally entered the camp, they marveled at his height. Magellan's men reached only to his waist, and his body was well proportioned, not monstrous but human, only magnified to a scale that seemed impossible. Pigafetta called these people Patagones, meaning big-footed, and the land itself took the name Patagonia, which it still carries today. Other explorers who ventured into those same wind-swept coasts would echo Pigafetta's words, sometimes measuring the giants at 7 feet, sometimes 9, sometimes 12. Francis Drake's chaplain claimed to have spoken with them. Anthony Knivet described seeing their corpses laid out. William Adams recounted battles with men of extraordinary stature. The last European to write of these beings was John Byron, the grandfather of the poet, who in 1766 claimed he had met a tribe of men over 9 feet tall. Yet when his journals were later edited, the numbers were quietly reduced, shrinking giants into tall men, shaving away the impossible until it resembled the merely unusual. What vanished here was not only a detail of height, but the weight of a legend. The possibility that history had brushed against another race of humanity. For centuries afterward, the mystery of the Patagonian giants has lingered in half-light, dismissed as exaggeration, the result of sailors weary and hungry, of distorted perspectives or tales told too many times around the fire. But the consistency of the accounts, separated by decades and carried by men who did not know one another, challenges that dismissal. They all described men of towering height, living in barren lands, clothed in little more than their own skin, marveling at the strangers who arrived from across the sea. And in their disappearance lies a riddle. If these people were mere fantasy, why did so many insist they had seen them? And if they were real, why did their presence fade so quickly into the fog of denial? Some say disease carried by Europeans erased them before the world could know them. Others suggest they were never numerous, already a dying remnant of something older, perhaps a race that had once stretched across continents. The Patagones were not the only giants the explorers wrote about. In the north, Alonso Alvarez de Pineda, sailing the Gulf of Mexico in 1519, claimed to have seen tribes of very small men, tribes of ordinary men, and tribes of towering men whose height reached 10 or 11 palms. Depending on how one measured a palm, this meant over 3 meters. So impressed was he by these enormous figures that he named a river after them, Rio de las Palmas, which appeared on maps as Rio de Gigantes, the River of Giants, and survives today as the Rio Grande. Hernando de Soto, cutting his bloody path through Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, was astounded when he met Chief Tuscaloosa, a man so much larger than those around him that he seemed to belong to another order of being. De Soto, greedy and arrogant, tried to take Tuscaloosa hostage, but the chief slipped away, and what followed was slaughter, fire, and mystery, for Tuscaloosa himself was never found again. In Mexico, Cortés and his men heard of a past in which the Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Aztecs, had fought against giants. At first they mocked the story, until the Tlaxcalans showed them bones, a femur as long as an ordinary man. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the soldier chronicler, confessed his astonishment, measuring himself against the bone and finding it equal to his own height. These were not idle tales. They were objects you could touch, bones you could carry, evidence that spoke louder than the laughter of skeptics. Native traditions across the continent remember these beings, and while details shift from tribe to tribe, one image recurs: giants with pale skin and red hair, sometimes bearded, often violent, sometimes living alongside humans but more often at war with them. The Chippewa tell of wars between 2 races of giants, one red-haired, one black-haired. The Paiute remember the Site-Ka, the tool-eaters, red-haired giants who harassed and hunted their ancestors until, cornered in Lovelock Cave, they were destroyed by fire. To many outsiders, these are legends, folklore meant to explain the inexplicable, but when miners in Nevada uncovered red-haired mummies in the very cave described, the line between myth and history blurred. Archaeologists who examined them noted their size, their strange artifacts, the blackened cave entrance that matched the tale of fire. Yet most of these remains vanished, misplaced in archives or lost to silence, until the story became again just a story. What emerges from these scattered voices, sailors, soldiers, priests, and indigenous storytellers, is not a single myth but a chorus. They sing of men who were too large to fit comfortably into our frame of history, and so, piece by piece, they were cut down. Their names survive in places: Patagonia, Rio de Gigantes, Tuscaloosa, reminders etched on maps long after the bodies were gone. But memory is a stubborn thing. It clings to the edges of rivers, to the silence of caves, to the mounds of Ohio, where skeletons of strange size have been unearthed. It whispers in the words of Abraham Lincoln, who spoke of the species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America. And though science today may shake its head, the traces remain, scattered and fragile, waiting for those willing to listen. The voyage of Magellan was remembered not only for its circumnavigation of the world, but for the ghostly memories it left behind. And when those memories crossed oceans, they began to multiply. Across Europe, whispers of giants in the New World seeped into taverns and courts alike. When Francis Drake sailed south in the 1570s, his chaplain confirmed what Pigafetta had written, that the people of Patagonia were not mere exaggerations, but real flesh and blood, towering over the tallest Englishmen. Anthony Knivet, an adventurer who wandered through Brazil, went further, claiming to have seen corpses of men 12 feet tall, bones laid out in villages where the dead were honored. The numbers shift. The accounts sometimes contradict each other, yet the core remains strangely stable. Somewhere at the edge of the known world, there walked people who could not fit within the ordinary frame of human size. The more the explorers wrote, the harder it became to dismiss all of them as liars or fools, and yet, over the centuries, their testimonies were shaved down by later editors, who reduced giants to tall men, turning 9 feet into 6, smoothing out the edges of the extraordinary until it could be tucked neatly into the ordinary. But what drives such editing? Was it embarrassment at the credulity of earlier explorers? Or was it a quiet recognition that these stories hinted at something too disruptive to be left unaltered? The last recorded European sighting of Patagonian giants came in 1766, when Commodore John Byron, grandfather of the poet, claimed to have met men over 9 feet tall. When his journal was later published, the figures were trimmed. The men became merely tall. And with that, the last echo of the Patagonian giants slipped into silence. Their land still carries their name, but their bodies, their bones, their traces, those were allowed to vanish. Yet as the southern giants disappeared from record, others emerged further north, for the Americas are vast, and each river and mountain hides its own tale. Alonso Alvarez de Pineda, mapping the Gulf of Mexico in 1519, stumbled upon a bewildering variety of tribes. Some were small, almost dwarfish. Others were ordinary. And some, he insisted, were immense, standing 3 meters tall. His wonder was such that he named a river after them, Rio de las Palmas, which was later marked as Rio de Gigantes by cartographers. That river is known today as the Rio Grande, its name eroded by time, its memory of giants forgotten by most. But the maps remain, mute witnesses to the astonishment of those who first saw them. In the tangled forests of the southeast, Hernando de Soto pressed deeper into native lands, driven by greed and the hunger for gold. What he found instead was a man whose very presence unsettled him. Tuscaloosa, the chief of a great people, was far taller than any Spaniard, his body towering over his companions. De Soto believed that such size must hide great wealth, and so he took Tuscaloosa hostage, dragging him to his fort in search of treasure. What followed was fire, massacre, and the sudden disappearance of the chief. Among the bodies burned in the battle, Tuscaloosa's was never found. Legends suggest he escaped, perhaps wounded, perhaps leading the remnants of his people into the wilderness. His very name, meaning Black Warrior, lingers in the land, in the city of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. In it remains the faint echo of a figure whose size and mystery defied the conquerors. Mexico, too, kept its memories. Cortés, standing on uncertain ground before the mighty Aztecs, laughed when the Tlaxcalans told him they had once fought giants. But the laughter died when they brought bones, enormous bones, thick as tree trunks, the femur of a man so tall it matched the height of an ordinary soldier. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, no stranger to battle or myth, confessed he was shaken. They sent the bone to Spain so that their king might see with his own eyes that such beings had once lived. But where that bone ended, no one can say. Perhaps it rests in some forgotten storeroom. Perhaps it crumbled to dust. Or perhaps it was hidden away to keep such unsettling truths from the official story of the New World. These accounts, scattered across lands and centuries, might be dismissed as coincidence were it not for the resonance they find in native memory. Among tribes from the Great Lakes to the desert basins of Nevada, stories of giants endure, passed down not as fanciful tales but as ancestral memory. The Chippewas speak of two races of giants locked in endless war, one red-haired and one black-haired. The red-haired triumphed, only to later turn their fury against humans. The Paiute remember the Siteka, red-haired giants who haunted marshes, eating the fibrous tool plant, and, when hungry, hunting people. Their harassment forced the Paiute to unite, to corner the giants in a cave and set fire at its mouth until none emerged alive. For generations, this was dismissed as legend. But when miners uncovered red-haired mummies in Lovelock Cave, along with artifacts and ash, the old story returned with new weight. Archaeologists who came later confirmed the remains, at least at first. They noted the size of the bones, the strange sandals twice the size of modern feet, the woven duck decoys astonishing in their craftsmanship. Yet the most dramatic finds, the mummies themselves, vanished. Museums declined to keep them, institutions turned away, and soon the cave's greatest secrets had slipped into silence. What survived were fragments, objects now displayed in small regional museums, stripped of their context, divorced from the tale that gave them meaning. To the Paiute, it was confirmation of their ancestors' courage. To modern skeptics, it became just another curiosity. And in between lies the question that hovers over all these stories: why does the evidence vanish whenever it surfaces? From Patagonia to Texas, from Alabama to Mexico, from the stories of conquistadors to the oral histories of native tribes, the image of giants recurs like a forgotten refrain. Too many voices, too many bones, too many names etched on maps to dismiss them as simple fantasy. Yet the silence of official record, the editing of journals, the disappearance of remains, all weave together into another story. One not only of giants, but of erasure. To follow the trail of these beings is to walk along the edge of history, where the extraordinary is always trimmed into the ordinary, and where memory itself becomes contested ground. If one follows the rivers of the American heartland, past the forests of Ohio and the rolling plains of Tennessee, one encounters a landscape shaped not only by nature, but by human hands, and perhaps by something more than human. Scattered across the land are great earth mounds, vast constructions of soil and stone that rise in curves and spirals, effigies of animals and serpents that stretch hundreds of feet, visible only from the sky. These mounds, long before settlers and surveyors arrived, were sacred places, burial sites, ceremonial grounds. But to many who dug into them in the 19th century, they were also the resting places of beings who did not fit into the frame of ordinary human life. In 1800, in Ashtabula County, Ohio, a burial site was uncovered that contained between 2,000 and 3,000 graves. Most of the skeletons were human, but among them were bones so large they could not be reconciled with normal men. Skulls big enough to fit an ordinary human skull inside, femurs as tall as a man's body. Newspapers of the time reported it with amazement, as if the land itself was speaking, revealing that its ancient inhabitants were not like those who now plowed its fields. Excavations continued through the century, and again there were whispers of giant bones drawn out of the mounds. The most famous of these sites is the Serpent Mound in Ohio, a sinuous figure carved into the earth, over 1,000 feet long, coiling like an immense reptile with its mouth open as if to swallow an egg-shaped hill. When Harvard professor Frederick Ward Putnam examined the mound in the late 19th century, he reported finding unusually tall skeletons, far larger than the norm. He was not a sensationalist, but a respected scholar, and he argued passionately for the preservation of these ancient earthworks. To him, they were more than curiosities. They were evidence of a past America whose story had been left untold. Yet, even as he called for preservation, the question of what those skeletons meant hung uncomfortably in the air. If they were truly the remains of giants, then the history of this land was older, stranger, and more complicated than textbooks admitted. Legends among native peoples echo the mystery of the mounds. Many tribes spoke of battles against a race of giants, fierce wars fought with arrows and fire, where men of great size and strength fell and were buried in earthen monuments. The Choctaw tell of Nahulo, white-skinned giants who once lived among them, towering over ordinary men, until at last they were destroyed. The Delaware recall stories of Allegewee, a giant people who once controlled the Ohio Valley, until driven out by the Lenape in an ancient war. These tales, once dismissed as mere myth, now seem to fit uneasily alongside the bones that have been unearthed. Were the mounds simple monuments of ritual, or were they graves meant to seal away something that did not belong among us? By the 19th century, reports of giant skeletons in the mounds had become so common that newspapers printed them with casual astonishment. In Wisconsin, in Georgia, in Tennessee, there were stories of skeletons 9 feet tall or taller. Farmers digging for foundations unearthed skulls of unnatural size. Amateur archaeologists carried bones to local museums, where they were displayed for a time before quietly disappearing. The New York Times published more than one article on these discoveries, and yet follow-ups rarely came. As quickly as the finds appeared, they vanished, leaving behind only clippings and memories. It was as if the earth was willing to give up its secrets, but the institutions of man were not willing to keep them. Why this silence? Some claim the bones crumbled when exposed to air, as John Wesley Powell once said of skeletons found in Iowa. Others suspect something more deliberate, that evidence which did not fit the accepted narrative of history was quietly removed. For at the same time that these discoveries were being reported, the Smithsonian Institution rose to prominence as the great custodian of America's past. And within its walls, a philosophy of isolationism took root, the belief that the native peoples of America had developed in isolation, untouched by foreign contact, untouched by giants, untouched by anything that did not conform to the clean lines of cultural evolution. The tension between isolationists and diffusionists, those who believed cultures shared common origins and influences, was fierce. For the Smithsonian, to admit the existence of giants was to admit that something had happened in the deep past that did not fit their model. Whether it was to preserve a narrative of national unity, to counter religious claims, or simply to avoid embarrassment, the result was the same. Bones disappeared, artifacts were lost, and the memory of giants was relegated to the margins. Yet the mounds remain, silent and immense. Walk along the coils of the serpent mound at dusk, and one feels the weight of something more than earth. Stand atop Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, where pyramidal mounds rise as if an ancient city once rivaled the metropolises of the Old World, and the imagination stirs with visions of a people whose leaders may have been more than men. Whether giants or simply rulers made giant by legend, the traces are there. Soil does not lie, even when bones are hidden. For many visitors in the 19th century, seeing a skeleton twice the size of an ordinary man was not extraordinary, but confirmation of what they already believed. The Bible spoke of giants before the flood, and if they existed then, why not here? When Abraham Lincoln stood at Niagara Falls in 1848, he wrote of the extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America. To him, and to his contemporaries, it was common knowledge that these bones were real, that America's earth held the remains of a lost race. Only later, as the story hardened into official history, did such knowledge become suspect, reduced to rumor, then to fringe. And yet the persistence of the stories, the physical presence of the mounds, the scattered reports across states and decades, all resist erasure. They form a tapestry too intricate to dismiss, even if frayed at the edges. Each account may be doubted, each bone may be said to have crumbled, but together they point to something more. That long before America became a nation, long before it was mapped and claimed, there lived upon it people who were not like us. They were taller, stronger, perhaps feared, perhaps revered, but undeniably remembered. As the sun sets over the fields of Ohio, casting long shadows across the serpent-shaped ridge, one is left with the sense that these earthworks are not only monuments to the dead, but to memory itself. Memory that refuses to die. Memory that insists giants once walked here, and that the truth of their existence still waits beneath the soil. The desert basins of Nevada hold a silence unlike any other, a silence that feels ancient, as if the wind itself remembers stories long forgotten. Among the Paiute, one such story has been told for generations, a story not of spirits or distant gods, but of flesh and blood beings whose presence haunted their ancestors. They called them the Si-te-ka, a name that meant tool-eaters, for these giants were said to consume the reeds and grasses that grew thick in the marshes. Yet food was not the only thing they consumed. In times of hunger, the Paiute said, the Si-te-ka turned to cannibalism, preying on unsuspecting humans, capturing and devouring them. They were described as tall, strong, with hair the color of fire, pale skin, and an insatiable appetite that kept the Paiute in fear for centuries. The Paiute legend does not present these giants as mystical beings, but as predators, enemies who could be fought, killed, and finally eradicated. According to the tale, There came a time when the harassment became unbearable, when the giants' raids forced the tribes to take action. Various Paiute groups banded together, uniting their strength to put an end to their tormentors. A final battle was fought, and the remaining Sitaka fled to a cave in the desert. The Paiute surrounded the entrance, piling wood and brush, and set it alight. Flaming arrows turned the cave mouth into a furnace. The giants trapped inside screamed, fought, and eventually fell silent as smoke and fire consumed them. The cave became their tomb, sealed not by ritual, but by vengeance. For generations, this was dismissed by outsiders as myth. White settlers in the 19th century scoffed at the tale, assuming it to be no more than a tribal legend, a cautionary story invented to explain odd rock formations or caves in the landscape. Yet the Paiute held the story as truth, and in the early 20th century, the desert itself seemed to vindicate them. In 1911, two miners named James Hart and David Pugh were hired to extract bat guano from a cave in northwest Nevada, guano being a valuable fertilizer. As they dug deeper into the deposits, they uncovered something unexpected: artifacts, woven sandals, nets, baskets, tools fashioned from stone and bone, all preserved in the dry cave environment. Then, more startling discoveries followed. Human-like mummies, unusually large, their skulls still bearing tufts of red hair. Some measured over 6 feet, others closer to 8, their size remarkable enough to stir immediate curiosity. Even more striking was the appearance of the cave entrance itself. Blackened, scorched, as though a great fire had once raged there, just as the Paiute legend described. Word reached the University of California, and professional archaeologists soon descended on the site. Reports from those early excavations mention not only the artifacts, but the giant mummies, preserved by the cave's conditions. The remains were studied, catalogued, and, according to official statements, misplaced or lost in the years that followed. What survived in museums were smaller items, sandals so large that no modern foot could fill them, duck decoys crafted with astonishing skill, stone tools, and woven fabrics. The mummies themselves, those red-haired figures who might have confirmed the Paiute legend beyond doubt, disappeared into obscurity. 12 years later, in 1924, a second excavation returned to Lovelock Cave. More artifacts were unearthed: slings, nets, tunics, even baskets shaped like ducks, designed to lure waterfowl. These too eventually found their way into small collections, some languishing in lesser-known museums, others ignored altogether. Only decades later, in the 1980s, did scholars finally analyze some of these items and confirm their age, more than 2,000 years old. The timeline fit eerily well with the oral traditions, suggesting that if the Paiute had invented their story, they had somehow invented it with uncanny archaeological precision. But the most dramatic finds, the giants themselves, remained absent. Some argue that they were destroyed, others that they were hidden by institutions unwilling to complicate the tidy story of America's past. For the Paiute, it was proof of what they had always said. Their ancestors had fought and defeated a race of red-haired giants. For skeptics, it was merely another case of exaggeration, tall tales wrapped around grains of truth. Yet, in Lovelock Cave, the blackened entrance still whispers of fire. The artifacts still testify to a lost people, and the memory of giants still stirs uneasily in the desert air. What makes the story of the Sitaka so compelling is the convergence of myth and material evidence. Most legends are intangible, resistant to proof, but here the earth itself yielded confirmation. The artifacts are real, displayed for those willing to seek them out. The fire-scorched entrance is real, visible to any visitor. And the reports of the miners and early archaeologists, whether exaggerated or not, speak of red-haired mummies, larger than life, that matched the old tales too closely to be coincidence. Sarah Winnemucca, the daughter of a Paiute chief, carried this story into the 20th century, even showing anthropologists a lock of red hair passed down through her family. She insisted it belonged to one of the vanquished giants. Her words, like the artifacts, were brushed aside, filed under folklore. Yet the persistence of her testimony, coupled with the discoveries at Lovelock, refuses to fade. One is left to wonder, how much evidence must be ignored before a legend is taken seriously? Standing at the mouth of Lovelock Cave today, one feels both the weight of history and the emptiness of absence. The cave is quiet, its guano long gone, its treasures scattered. Visitors can see the burn marks, but the giants are nowhere to be found. It is as if the desert itself conspired to preserve the story while allowing the proof to slip away, leaving us only with questions. Were the Sitaka a distinct race of humans, taller and stronger than the tribes who opposed them? Were they survivors of some ancient migration? Remnants of a lost lineage that once spanned the continent? Or were they myth made flesh by coincidence, their bones mismeasured, their stories magnified by fear and memory? The Paiute do not hesitate in their answer. To them, the Siteka were real, they were enemies, and they were destroyed in the flames of Lovelock Cave. Their ancestors fought them, defeated them, and left behind a story not of imagination, but of survival. For those who listen, the echo of that battle can still be heard, carried on the dry desert wind, rustling through the reeds of vanished marshes. The giants may be gone, but the land remembers, and in its silence the question lingers. What else lies buried, waiting to rise again? In the summer of 1833, on the coast of California, near what is now Lompoc, a group of Mexican soldiers was given a simple task: dig a pit for storing gunpowder. The ground was hard, a layer of cemented gravel that resisted their shovels, so they turned to picks, chipping deeper into the earth. What they found instead of a powder pit was something so startling that it sent ripples of fear through the local tribes. Beneath the gravel lay bones, immense bones, belonging to what appeared to be a human-like skeleton more than 12 feet tall. The jaws were immense, lined not with a single row of teeth, but with two, a grotesque doubling that made the figure even more alien. Around the skeleton were burial offerings, axes hewn from stone of unusual size, fragments of pottery, and blocks of porphyry carved with strange symbols no one could read. The local Indians who had helped with the digging recoiled in terror when they realized what had been uncovered. To them, it was not a marvel, but a nightmare, the physical remains of a race that their ancestors had long whispered about. Their chief demanded that the soldiers rebury the remains at an undisclosed location, and the Mexican authorities, perhaps unnerved themselves, agreed. The skeleton was laid back into the earth, its resting place lost to memory. Today, the land belongs to the Vandenberg Space Force Base, a place as inaccessible to curious seekers as it was in the 19th century. The bones remain buried, locked away by both earth and authority, the story remembered only in fragments. It would not be the last time giant skeletons emerged in America. In Ohio, where the land is rich with mounds, farmers and explorers stumbled upon graves that yielded bones of unusual size. In one excavation, skulls were said to be so capacious that an ordinary human head could fit inside. In another, skeletons stretched 8, 9, even 10 feet. Reports spread through local papers, telling readers of these extraordinary finds. Some of the bones were displayed briefly in county fairs or small museums before vanishing, claimed by collectors or institutions, their whereabouts lost. The pattern was already becoming familiar. Discovery, amazement, disappearance. Accounts of skeletons with double rows of teeth recur across states and decades. The peculiarity of such a trait made them memorable. In some traditions, it was said to be the mark of great strength, as though nature itself had reinforced the jaw for a race meant to be predators. In others, it was a sign of deformity, proof that these beings were not quite human. Whether exaggeration or truth, the repetition of the detail in scattered reports lends it a curious weight. A giant with 2 rows of teeth is not easily forgotten, nor easily invented in the same way by witnesses who never knew one another. The soldiers in California were not the only ones to feel dread at their discovery. Throughout the 19th century, as settlers pressed into new lands, they found themselves digging up evidence that did not match the world they thought they knew. In Wisconsin, in Georgia, in Tennessee, and across the Great Plains, giant skeletons were reported. The New York Times itself carried stories of such finds, in one case describing skeletons 14 feet tall unearthed in Georgia, and in another reporting 9-foot-tall figures in Wisconsin. These were not obscure pamphlets or rumors whispered in bars. They were published in one of the nation's leading newspapers. And yet, as swiftly as the stories appeared, they faded. No follow-up, no photographs, no bones on display. Only the clippings remain, yellowed reminders of discoveries that should have rewritten history, but instead dissolved into silence. In Oklahoma, treasure hunters blasting into the Spiro Mounds during the Great Depression claimed to have found a burial chamber filled with riches, pearls, copper, and among them, the body of a man over 7 feet tall, clad in armor. To discover a skeleton of such size was astonishing enough, but armor made of metal in a mound in Oklahoma was a detail that threatened to upset the entire story of America's past. Institutions, including the Smithsonian, moved quickly to acquire the artifacts. Yet today, none of them are on display. The chamber itself, according to some accounts, was destroyed with dynamite, leaving behind no trace but the memories of those who first saw it. One can sense in these stories not only the drama of the finds, but the unease they produced. If giants once walked this land, what did that mean for the histories being written in neat lines by scholars and curators? How would they fit into the story of Native America, of migration across the Bering Strait, of human evolution itself? The bones refused to fit, and so the solution, time and again, was to make them vanish. The soldiers in Lompoc who stood in shock before the double-toothed jaws, the farmers in Ohio who carried skulls too large for their barns, the journalists who published stories of 10-foot skeletons, all became temporary witnesses to a truth that could not be allowed to stand. Their testimonies survive in scraps, their bones in whispers, their artifacts in dusty storerooms. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Giants are found, giants disappear, and the official record remains unchanged. Yet in the imagination of those who lived through the discoveries, the presence of giants was undeniable. They spoke of them in taverns and parlors, in tribal councils and newspapers, in quiet journals and public speeches. Abraham Lincoln himself, decades before becoming president, acknowledged the bones that filled America's mounds, as if it were common knowledge. To his generation, it was not a wild claim, but an accepted fact that the land held the remains of beings larger than ordinary men. Only later, as the century turned and academic orthodoxy tightened, did the giants retreat into the shadows of forgotten memory. Still, the stories endure, carried forward not by institutions but by people, by families who claim their great-grandfather once unearthed a bone the size of a beam, by tribes who preserve legends of wars with towering enemies, by old clippings and lost maps. Each fragment alone may be doubted, but together they weave a haunting consistency, as if the land itself insists on a truth that cannot be buried forever. In the dry winds of California, where the giant with 2 rows of teeth was returned to the earth, in the green hills of Ohio, where mounds conceal bones too large to name, in the vanished chamber of Spiro, where an armored giant once lay, the silence is heavy. It is a silence that asks whether the past we have been taught is the whole past, or merely the part that could be controlled. And as long as these silences remain, the mystery of America's giants will continue to stir just beneath the surface, waiting for the day when they can no longer be ignored. The desert, with its endless sands and silence, has always been a keeper of secrets, preserving what wetter climates would erase. In Nevada, among the barren ridges and dry valleys, another secret emerged in the 1940s, one that for decades would remain hidden in plain sight. Sidney and Georgia Wheeler, a husband and wife team of archaeologists working for the Nevada State Parks Division, were exploring a remote cave east of Fallon when they stumbled upon something extraordinary. The cave would later be known as Spirit Cave, and its contents would ignite one of the strangest chapters in American archaeology. Inside the cave, wrapped carefully in woven mats, the Wheelers discovered the remains of 2 mummies. These were not the desiccated animal carcasses or fragmented bones one might expect, but human-like bodies preserved with astonishing care. The dry air had shrunk their skin to leather, but their forms remained intact, their burial deliberate, as if they had been entombed with reverence. Alongside them lay nearly 70 artifacts, woven sandals, finely crafted tools, and the mats themselves, which spoke of a culture both skilled and attentive to ritual. But what struck the Wheelers most was the size of the bodies. One, the male, appeared especially large, his proportions unusual, his skull elongated in a way that suggested something outside the familiar. The female, though smaller, was also larger than typical native burials of the region. For the Wheelers, the discovery was momentous, yet the world paid little attention. The bodies were placed in a museum, their story relegated to obscurity. For decades, Spirit Cave was a footnote, a curiosity known to few outside the small circle of Nevada archaeology. But silence has a way of breaking, and in the 1990s, long after the Wheelers had passed, the mummies returned to the center of a storm. In 1996, anthropologist R. Irv Taylor of the University of California, Riverside, was searching for specimens to test with his laboratory's new accelerator mass spectrometer. Spirit Cave's mummies, forgotten for half a century, seemed ideal. When the dating results came back, the numbers were so startling that even Taylor hesitated. The male mummy dated to more than 9,400 years before present, a staggering figure that pushed back the timeline of human habitation in North America far beyond what most archaeologists were willing to accept. This was not only older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than most known civilizations. It was older than the accepted framework of human presence in the Americas, at a time when textbooks insisted that human migration to the continent had occurred no more than 12,000 years ago. Spirit Cave suddenly opened a window into a past that seemed impossible. Yet the controversy did not end with the dating. For when scientists examined the physical features of the mummies, they noted traits that did not align easily with the local Paiute people, whom the U.S. government soon declared to be their descendants. The Spirit Cave man had a long, narrow skull with features some compared to Nordic or European types. His cranium was elongated, his jaw strong, his teeth well preserved. To some, this suggested that he belonged to a population distinct from modern native tribes, perhaps even linked to ancient migrations that had crossed the Bering Strait thousands of years earlier. To others, it was evidence that should never be spoken aloud, for it complicated the delicate politics of identity and heritage. The Bureau of Land Management intervened swiftly, citing the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, a law requiring that remains identified as Native American be returned to their tribes for reburial. The Paiute Shoshone tribe of Fallon requested the return of the mummies, claiming them as ancestors. Anthropologists who had studied the remains countered that the evidence suggested otherwise, that the Spirit Cave mummies were too ancient, too physically distinct to belong directly to the Paiute lineage. The battle between science and law, between memory and evidence, escalated into court cases and appeals. Meanwhile, the mummies themselves disappeared from public view, seized by federal authorities and placed in storage. For many, this intervention felt eerily familiar. Once again, just as with the Mounds of Ohio and the caves of Lovelock, physical evidence that pointed toward a race of unusual beings was spirited away, lost to research, denied to the public. The dating had been done. The results were clear. These bodies were 10,000 years old. But instead of rewriting history, the story was buried under bureaucracy. Critics whispered that this was less about respect for tribal claims than about control of the narrative, about ensuring that nothing disrupted the carefully constructed timeline of America's past. The Spirit Cave discovery forced uncomfortable questions into the open. Who were these people? If not Paiute, then from what lineage did they descend? Could they have been remnants of an ancient population that once included the red-haired giants described in Paiute legend? Were they part of a migration wave distinct from the ancestors of modern Native Americans? A wave that left only fragments, bones, artifacts, and memories before vanishing. And why did they appear to share physical traits with populations thousands of miles away, across the oceans? In the absence of access to the mummies, speculation grew. Some claimed the Spirit Cave man was proof of a prehistoric Caucasoid presence in North America. Others argued he represented a genetic diversity among early migrants that had since disappeared. A few, more daring, connected him directly to the legends of giants, pointing to his unusual size, his burial in careful wrappings, his place in a region already linked to the Sai Te Ka. If Lovelock Cave held the last of the giants, Perhaps Spirit Cave held their ancestors. The silence of the official institutions only deepened the mystery. Museums declined to display the artifacts. Government agencies refused to release photographs or detailed reports. Even scholars who had studied the remains were cautious, hedging their words, aware that to speak too boldly might invite censure. And so Spirit Cave joined the long list of American sites, where evidence of the extraordinary was first revealed, then concealed, leaving behind only the faint traces of what might have been. But the desert does not forget. Visitors to the area can still walk near the cave, still see the barren ridges where the wheelers first dug. The land holds its memory, even if human institutions do not. The wind through the sagebrush seems to whisper of a time when men of unusual form walked here, when burial was not only an act of reverence, but of concealment, as if those who wrapped the Spirit Cave man knew he was not like others and sought to preserve him in secrecy. The story of Spirit Cave is not only about bones and artifacts, but about the fragility of truth. Each time evidence surfaces, it teeters on the edge of being lost, buried by fear, erased by policy, hidden by those who prefer silence to disruption. And yet, even as the mummies are locked away, their existence is undeniable. The dates cannot be erased. The photographs that were taken cannot be unseen. The questions cannot be unasked. When one stands beneath the vast Nevada sky, looking at the same stars that shone down 10,000 years ago, it is impossible not to wonder who the Spirit Cave man was. A hunter? A leader? A survivor of a race that once thrived and then faded? His bones say he was real. His silence says his story is not finished. And for those willing to listen, he remains a voice from a deeper past than we ever imagined, asking us to reconsider not only who we are, but who walked this land before us. Long before Columbus ever glimpsed the shores of the New World, before Cortes marched into Tenochtitlan or De Soto crossed the Mississippi, there were others who had touched these lands. The sagas of the Norse tell of a people who braved the icy seas, steering their longships beyond Greenland, blown by storms into a place they called Vinland. To the Vikings, it was a land of wild grapes, maple trees, and fertile soil, richer than the hard rocks of Iceland or the icebound coast of Greenland. Yet it was not uninhabited. Within these sagas are tales of encounters, strange, unsettling, and sometimes violent, with beings they called skellering or skraelings. Most historians today interpret the skraelings as indigenous peoples, their strangeness exaggerated by Norse eyes. But buried in the sagas are details that resist easy explanation. Some accounts describe these beings as horribly ugly, covered in hair, with large black eyes that seemed to swallow the light. They were said to tower over even the tallest Norsemen, who themselves were no small men, often over 6 feet tall. To stand 7 feet or more was not unusual in Scandinavia, and yet the sagas insist that the creatures they met were taller still. Immense figures whose power made even Viking warriors uneasy. These details blur the line between reality and myth, suggesting that what the Norse encountered may not have been ordinary tribes, but something stranger, something echoing the giants remembered in so many lands. In Norse mythology, giants, or Jötnar, are primal beings, older than men, embodiments of chaos and nature's raw force. They fought gods, mingled with them, sometimes birthed offspring with humans. For a Viking to describe meeting giants across the sea was not simply metaphor, but a way of fitting experience into their worldview. When Leif Erikson's men landed in Newfoundland and saw figures with strange proportions, immense strength, and savage appearance, perhaps the only word they had was giant. Some sagas say the encounters ended in skirmishes, with arrows flying and blood spilled. Others say the Norse fled, unwilling to test their steel against beings that seemed beyond human. What is striking is how these stories echo the legends of America's native tribes. The Mandan of North Dakota, for instance, have long been noted for individuals with light hair and blue eyes, a peculiarity that early explorers puzzled over. Some suggested Norse blood had mingled with the tribe. Others whispered of a deeper connection, that perhaps the red-haired giants found in Nevada and remembered by the Paiute were kin to the Norse who arrived centuries later. Could it be that the giants were not a separate race at all, but an ancient branch of humanity that shared roots with the tall, fair-haired peoples of Europe? Or did the Vikings, in their brief landings, stumble into an older story already written into the soil of America, a story that had nothing to do with them, but everything to do with the giants who had been here long before? The sagas of Vinland do not dwell only on grapes and timber. They tell of battles where arrows rained down, of beast-like men with immense bodies, of camps abandoned in haste. One tale speaks of a giant figure who struck terror into the crew, so powerful that even seasoned warriors fled. Another mentions creatures who, despite their brutish looks, displayed cunning, ambushing the Norse with tactics that spoke of intelligence, not mere savagery. These encounters left such an impression that they became part of the oral tradition, woven into the larger myth of exploration and struggle. If the Norse accounts were alone, they might be dismissed as exaggeration or confusion. But paired with the legends of red-haired giants in Nevada, with the bones from Ohio Mounds, with the strange reports from California, a pattern emerges that stretches across oceans. The giants appear not as isolated myths, but as a recurring presence, adapted to each culture's language, yet describing the same essential image. Tall, pale-skinned, often red-haired beings who lived alongside humans, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as lords, and always as figures too large to be ignored. Archaeological traces also whisper of Norse presence deeper into the continent than once believed. Rune stones of disputed origin have been found in Minnesota and Oklahoma. Their inscriptions controversial, often dismissed as hoaxes, but persistent enough to stir curiosity. Some have suggested that these inscriptions, if genuine, might mark the roots of Viking explorers who ventured further inland. If so, did they encounter descendants of the giants remembered in native traditions? Did they leave behind not only stones, but memories of encounters too strange to forget? The Mandan themselves became part of this debate. Their lighter features drew speculation from early European settlers who wondered whether they were the offspring of Vikings, or perhaps of something older still. Some chroniclers claimed Mandan stories included memories of immense beings, protectors or enemies, whose blood might still run through their people. Whether exaggeration or truth, the coincidence of appearance and story created an enduring puzzle. The Norse sagas also carry an echo of another mystery. The creatures they fought were described not only as tall, but as hairy, covered in coarse fur, their eyes dark and large. To modern readers, these descriptions sound uncannily like the later legends of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Could the Norse have been the first Europeans to record encounters with these elusive beings long before the name Bigfoot was ever spoken? Or were these simply another branch of the same family of giants, some bearded and red-haired, others darker, wilder, closer to beast than man? It is tempting to see the sagas as mere tales, shaped by the Viking love of drama and myth. Yet when set beside the archaeology of Spirit Cave, the legends of Lovelock, the bones of the Mounds, they no longer seem so easily dismissed. They are another voice in the chorus, another testimony that across continents and centuries, people remembered encountering beings larger than life. When the Norse longships turned back toward Greenland, carrying grapes and timber, they also carried memories. They spoke of a land both rich and hostile, fertile yet inhabited by creatures they could neither conquer nor understand. The sagas were copied, retold, softened by time. But their essence remains. Across the ocean lay a land where giants roamed, where men met their match not in kings or armies, but in beings who seemed to belong to an older world. And as the centuries passed, those stories folded into the broader fabric of giant lore, adding to the strange harmony of voices that stretch from Patagonia to Ohio, from Paiute Desert to Vinland's cold shores. Each story different, each story the same. A race too tall, too strong, too strange to be forgotten, yet too inconvenient to be remembered. Every story that lingers in human memory eventually seeks an origin, a beginning that explains how the extraordinary came to be. For centuries, tales of giants have floated in the realm of myth, linked to divine wrath or the chaos before the flood. Yet when bones began surfacing from the mounds of America, and when red-haired mummies were drawn out of Nevada caves, the question became harder to ignore. If these beings were real, where had they come from? Were they a separate species, a branch of humanity lost in prehistory? Or were they simply men of unusual height mythologized into something more? One theory that has grown quietly in archaeological and paleoanthropological circles looks back not to America itself, but to the deep past of Europe and Asia. Long before modern humans spread across the globe, two populations walked the earth. Neanderthals, compact and powerful, adapted to cold environments, and Cro-Magnons, taller and leaner, the ancestors of what we call modern Homo sapiens. Their paths crossed in Europe, and genetic evidence today shows that they interbred. Most people alive now carry a trace of Neanderthal DNA, faint echoes of encounters tens of thousands of years ago. But what if, in some cases, this interbreeding produced not ordinary humans, but hybrids whose size and strength surpassed both parent groups? The Neanderthal skeleton, thick-boned and muscular, speaks of a body built for endurance and power. The Cro-Magnon skeleton, long-limbed and tall, reveals a frame capable of height and speed. Combined, it is not difficult to imagine offspring who might have inherited the raw strength of the Neanderthal with the towering stature of the Cro-Magnon, producing individuals far beyond the norm. Such hybrids could easily have appeared as giants to their contemporaries, men whose height brushed the rafters of caves, whose strength bent the expectations of what human flesh could endure. If such a race existed, the question becomes how far they traveled. The last great ice age created not only glaciers and mammoths, but a land bridge between Asia and North America. The Bering Strait, now a channel of icy water, was once a corridor of tundra and steppe, a frozen highway linking Siberia to Alaska. Across this bridge, waves of humans passed, following herds, chasing survival, carrying with them tools, fire, and memory. If hybrids of unusual size were among them, then it is not hard to see how they could have spread southward into the vast continent that awaited. Imagine them pressing into North America while the glaciers still gripped the land, hunting across the plains, building shelters of stone and earth, leaving behind mounds to honor their dead. Over tens of thousands of years, their presence would have mingled with smaller tribes, sometimes interbreeding, sometimes dominating, sometimes vanishing in battle. The oral traditions that speak of wars between humans and giants may echo these ancient clashes, memories of encounters passed down across generations until myth and history blurred. Skeptics will argue that no such race has been found in the fossil record, that no skeleton taller than modern men has been reliably dated to such early times. Yet the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in a continent where so much remains unexcavated and where so many finds have mysteriously vanished. The Serpent Mound still rises, Lovelock Cave still bears its fire-scorched entrance, Spirit Cave still holds its silence. What if the bones that once lay within them were part of this lineage? Hybrids that carried the mark of an ancient union between Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon? The theory gains weight when one considers how consistently legends describe giants not as ethereal beings, but as human-like, flesh and blood, with families, leaders, and wars. The Tlaxcalans showed Cortes bones, not myths. The Paiute described the Siteka as eating reeds and raiding villages, not as gods in the sky. The explorers of Patagonia wrote of men who danced, laughed, and traded, not phantoms. These giants were remembered as part of the human world, not outside it. That fits less with the idea of supernatural monsters and more with the idea of a human variation, one that science has yet to fully confront. Other theories suggest that these beings may not have been hybrids at all, but simply a population of unusually tall humans, descendants of Cro-Magnons, who carried a genetic predisposition for height. Across the world, there are pockets of such variation even today. The Dinka of Sudan, the Dutch of Europe, the basketball players whose 7-foot frames still astound us, all remind us that human height can stretch far beyond the average. If a tribe or race carried such genes in concentration, their stature could have been extreme. Over time, if they died out or mingled with smaller groups, their memory would survive not in bones, but in story. And yet, the legends often include details that suggest more than height. Double rows of teeth, as seen in California. Enormous strength, beyond what height alone would grant. Red hair, recurring so consistently across tribes that it cannot be ignored. These traits hint at something unique. Not simply tall men, but a people distinct, perhaps descended from a lineage now lost. If one accepts the possibility, then the migrations across the Bering Land Bridge become more than a dry note in prehistory. They become the stage for an epic of survival and transformation, where tribes of ordinary humans moved southward alongside giants, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. As glaciers melted and the bridge was swallowed by the sea, those who had crossed were cut off, isolated in the vastness of America. Here they flourished for a time, leaving their mark in mounds, in caves, in bones, until the tide of history turned against them. Disease, warfare, climate shifts, or human hostility may have eroded their numbers until they vanished, leaving behind only the echoes of their presence. The idea of hybrid giants born from ancient interbreeding may seem speculative, yet it carries the strange appeal of explaining too much to dismiss. It fits the archaeological puzzle pieces scattered across continents, the bones found in mounds, the skulls too large for ordinary men, the consistent legends of tribes across America. It does not require the intervention of gods or aliens, only the unpredictable alchemy of biology and migration. In this light, the giants of America are not phantoms, but kin, branches of the same tree whose roots run through Africa, Europe, and Asia. They are reminders that humanity has never been a single uniform line, but a braided river, its currents mixing and separating, sometimes producing eddies that swirled briefly before disappearing. The giants may have been one such eddy, a brief flowering of form and strength that could not last but left behind enough traces to haunt our imagination forever. Standing at the edge of the Bering Strait today, one sees only water and ice. But once, across that frozen land, entire peoples moved, carrying fire and memory, crossing into a world untouched. Among them, perhaps, were men whose heads brushed the sky, whose shadows dwarfed their companions, who would one day be remembered in whispers as giants. And though their bones may be gone, their story still lingers, like the faint outline of a giant's footprint pressed into the soil of history. By the middle of the 19th century, the idea that giants once roamed America was not an outlandish claim whispered on the margins, but a notion spoken openly, even by the men who shaped the nation itself. In 1848, a lanky young congressman named Abraham Lincoln visited Niagara Falls, and as he stood before the roaring cascade, he was moved to write words that revealed how deeply the image of giants lived in the American mind. He wrote that, "The eyes of that species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America have gazed on Niagara as ours do now." To Lincoln, this was not speculation, not a metaphor, but an observation of what was then common knowledge. The mounds of the Midwest and Ohio Valley contained the bones of a race of men so large they were called giants. His words carried no irony. They were an acknowledgement of a truth his contemporaries understood. At that time, travelers could walk into natural history museums, county fairs, and private collections and see the bones for themselves. Skulls large enough to hold another skull inside, femurs taller than a man's torso, skeletons measuring 8, 9, even 10 feet long. Newspapers reported these discoveries with fascination, describing the scenes of excavation, the awe of witnesses. The Smithsonian Institution, founded in 1846, even received some of these remains into its collection. For a brief window, America seemed ready to accept that its soil held evidence of an ancient race whose size set them apart. But as the 19th century wore on, a strange transformation occurred. What had been open acknowledgement shifted into silence. Institutions that once displayed giant bones now locked them away or declared them hoaxes. Scholars who once wrote of them now dismissed them. In the span of a few decades, giants went from being part of the public conversation to being relegated to the shadows. The question is why? Some point to the changing winds of science. The mid-19th century was a time of upheaval, when Darwin's theories of evolution began to take root, when anthropology sought to establish itself as a serious discipline. when archaeology shifted from the province of adventurers to the hands of professionals. In this new order, tales of giants seemed too close to folklore, too disruptive to the clean story of human development scholars were constructing. To admit giants was to admit that the past was messier, more varied, more mysterious than the new science allowed. It threatened to blur the boundaries between myth and fact, between Bible and history, and so it was easier to push the bones aside. But others suggest a more deliberate effort. After the Civil War, America was a fractured nation, struggling to forge unity from division. The government sought a story that would bind its people together, a narrative of common origin and destiny. Giants, with their red hair, double teeth, and foreign appearance, did not fit neatly into this story. They suggested connections across oceans, migrations older than Columbus, even hints of races that were not Native American at all. Some feared this would fuel dangerous speculation, embolden religious sects like the Mormons who claimed ancient Israelite tribes had reached America, or fracture the fragile unity of a country still healing from war. Better, perhaps, to let the giants fade. Within the Smithsonian itself, this tendency crystallized into policy. John Wesley Powell, a veteran of the Civil War and a man who would become director of the U.S. Geological Survey and head of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, held a firm belief in cultural isolationism. He argued that Native Americans had developed independently, without influence from Old World civilizations. This view became doctrine within the institution, a line drawn firmly between America and the rest of the world. Anything that suggested contact, whether Norse runestones, Old World artifacts, or the bones of giants, was an inconvenience. Under Powell's leadership, the Smithsonian focused on fitting discoveries into the isolationist framework. Finds that did not fit were dismissed, locked away, or in some cases reported destroyed. Contemporary accounts speak of skeletons delivered to the Smithsonian that vanished into storage, never to be displayed again. In 1895, a mummy over 8 feet tall was discovered in San Diego. The Smithsonian purchased it for what was then a small fortune, only to declare later that it was a hoax and destroyed it. In Iowa, giant skeletons unearthed in burial mounds were said to crumble to dust when exposed to air, an explanation that satisfied few but silenced further inquiry. Newspapers like the New York Times, which had once printed front-page stories of giants found in Georgia and Wisconsin, began to fall silent after initial reports, as if discouraged from pursuing the subject further. Lincoln's words at Niagara now seem almost prophetic, not only because they preserve the memory of giants, but because they mark the moment before the silence descended. He lived in a time when the presence of giant bones in mounds was considered fact, not controversy. But by the end of the century, that knowledge had been reshaped, tucked away until it became the stuff of whispers. What had been open truth was now fringe, left to those willing to defy institutions to keep telling the stories. And yet, the land itself refuses to let go. The mounds still rise in fields and forests, their shapes traced by surveyors, their interiors holding secrets untouched. The rivers still flow past places named for giants, from Rio de Gigantes to Tuscaloosa. The soil still yields occasional fragments, oversized tools, sandals too long for any modern foot, burial chambers unearthed by accident and hastily covered again. Each piece is a reminder that history's erasure is never complete, Memory seeps through cracks, carried by story, anchored in place names, preserved in Lincoln's own hand. The Smithsonian controversy remains one of the most persistent shadows over the tale of America's giants. Whether through neglect, ideology, or deliberate concealment, the fact remains that hundreds of reported skeletons and artifacts are unaccounted for. To those who believe in the giants, this is proof of a cover-up, an attempt to erase a chapter of history that does not fit. To skeptics, it is evidence of exaggeration, of bones mismeasured or misidentified, of newspapers chasing sensation. Yet even skeptics struggle to explain why so many consistent accounts, stretching from explorers to presidents, from native elders to scholars, all speak of the same thing. What lingers most is not certainty, but tension, a tension between the stories carved into the land and the silence of institutions, between the words of Abraham Lincoln and the denials of those who came after. Somewhere in that tension lies the truth, waiting to be uncovered. The giants may be gone, their bones hidden or destroyed, but the echo of their presence continues to reverberate, as unstoppable as the roar of Niagara itself. The twilight years of the 19th century brought America into an age of discovery and doubt. A time when the soil yielded wonders, but the halls of authority increasingly turned away from them. It was during this period that some of the most dramatic reports of giants surfaced, only to vanish in silence almost as quickly as they appeared. These cases, preserved in old newspapers and fading eyewitness accounts, read now like fragments of a forgotten epic. In 1895, San Diego was a small but growing town on the edge of California's southern coast. That year, workers digging near the desert reported finding a mummy unlike any they had ever seen. It stood over 8 feet tall, its features dried but distinct, its proportions too immense to be mistaken for anything ordinary. Word spread quickly, drawing crowds of curious spectators who paid coins to see the marvel. The story reached the Smithsonian, which offered the extraordinary sum of $500, equivalent to many thousands today, for the mummy's purchase. The institution acquired it, promising study. But by 1908, when inquiries were made about its fate, officials declared it had been tested, proven a hoax, and destroyed. No record of the tests, no photographs, no bones. What had been the talk of the town had evaporated into bureaucratic smoke. To believers, it was a clear example of suppression. To skeptics, it was the fate of a carnival oddity exposed. Yet the detail that lingers is the willingness of the Smithsonian to pay such a high price for a hoax. If it were truly obvious, why buy it at all? The pattern repeated across the Midwest and South. The New York Times, then one of the most respected newspapers in the nation, published articles describing skeletons of enormous size unearthed in Wisconsin, Georgia, and beyond. One article described skeletons 14 feet long, bodies that would have dwarfed even the tallest modern humans. Another told of skulls discovered in burial mounds that suggested men of prodigious stature. Yet after these dramatic announcements, silence followed. No follow-up articles, no museum displays, no academic reports. The discoveries were swallowed whole, leaving behind nothing but headlines. To readers at the time, it was perplexing. To us, more than a century later, it feels like the sound of doors closing, the deliberate shutting out of voices that did not fit the script of history being written. Then came Spiro. In the early 1930s, deep in the heart of Oklahoma, treasure hunters pried open the Spiro Mounds, one of the most significant Native American earthworks in the country. What they found inside was dazzling. Pearls by the thousands, copper plates etched with designs, ceremonial objects of stunning artistry. But among the riches, they also claimed to have found a burial unlike any other. A male body, over 7 feet tall, clad in full metal armor, lay entombed in the mound. To find such a figure in the midst of native artifacts was astonishing. Armor suggested contact with old-world traditions, or something else entirely. The body, like the San Diego mummy, was reportedly offered to institutions, including the Smithsonian. The artifacts, too, were purchased and dispersed. But today, none of the armor remains, none of the pearls, none of the body. To make matters worse, the burial chamber itself was said to have been destroyed with dynamite, sealing forever what might have been the most extraordinary find in American archaeology. Skeptics argued that such claims are exaggerated, that the treasure hunters, desperate for money during the Great Depression, inflated their stories to increase value. But this explanation does not erase the consistency of reports across decades. From San Diego to Spiro, from Wisconsin to Georgia, the refrain is the same. Giants discovered, evidence purchased or seized, silence thereafter. Too many bones vanish, too many artifacts crumble, too many stories die in the dark. Coincidence becomes harder to defend. What is left to us are the newspaper clippings, the faded photographs of excavation sites, and the whispers of those who saw the finds before they disappeared. These fragments are not enough to satisfy science, which demands bones in drawers and measurements on charts. But they are enough to trouble memory, to keep alive the possibility that behind every vanished skeleton there was once a body, flesh and blood, tall as 2 men. And there is the question of motive. Why destroy or hide? Some point to ideology, the isolationist creed of men like John Wesley Powell, who sought to sever America from any suggestion of foreign or supernatural influence. Others point to politics, the desire to present a unified narrative of the American people untainted by mysteries. Still others whisper of darker motives, of private collections hoarded by elites, of evidence locked away because it contradicted not just history, but power. The Spiro Mounds tragedy is especially haunting because it robbed not only the memory of giants, but also the cultural heritage of the Native Americans, whose ancestors built those mounds. In the quest for treasure, a sacred site was torn apart, its secrets blasted into dust. What remains is a cautionary tale of how greed and suppression can conspire to erase the past, leaving behind only scars in the earth. Even so, the stories endure. Locals in San Diego still speak of the mummy that once drew crowds. Descendants of those who dug Spiro still tell of armor and pearls, and the yellowed pages of the New York Times still carry the headlines of giant skeletons unearthed. These fragments may not prove the giants beyond doubt, but they refuse to let the story die. They remind us that history is not always what institutions declare, that sometimes the truth lingers in the margins, waiting for eyes willing to see. By the dawn of the 20th century, the narrative of giants had been nearly erased from official history, yet the soil continued to yield its secrets. Farmers still unearthed bones too large to explain. Caves still whispered of mummies long forgotten. Presidents and poets still spoke of giants as if their presence was woven into the fabric of the land. It was a contradiction that could not be resolved, and so it was ignored. But ignoring does not erase. The San Diego mummy may be gone, the Spiro giant buried in rubble, the Wisconsin skeletons crumbled to dust, but the echo of their existence continues, as persistent as the rivers that flow past the mounds, carving into the soil that still remembers. If the explorers' journals and the yellowed newspapers of the 19th century preserve one half of the story, the other half lives in the voices of America's first peoples. Long before shovels pried open mounds or miners uncovered caves, tribes across the continent carried memories of encounters with beings larger than life. These stories were not told as distant fables, but as accounts woven into the very fabric of identity, passed from generation to generation, as real as rivers and mountains. To dismiss them as mere myth is to misunderstand how memory endures among oral cultures. For the Chippewa, the Delaware, the Choctaw, the Paiute, and countless others, giants were not an allegory, but an enemy, sometimes a rival, sometimes a terror, sometimes a shadow of kinship, but always present. The Chippewa speak of a time when the land was contested not only by men, but by giants of different races. In their telling, two groups of giants waged war, one red-haired, one black-haired. The black-haired race was ultimately destroyed, leaving the red-haired to clash with human tribes. It is a story that feels almost like a prelude to the battles described by the Paiute, who remembered the Siteka, the red-haired marauders of the Nevada desert. Across thousands of miles, across centuries of retelling, the image remains. Giants with fiery hair who fought among themselves and with humans. One cannot help but notice how such tales mirror the archaeological finds of Lovelock Cave, where mummies with tufts of red hair were indeed uncovered. The Delaware, whose memory stretches back through the valleys of the Ohio River, remember a race they call the Allegawe. According to their traditions, the Allegawe were giants who once held dominion over the great river valley. When the Lenape, ancestors of the Delaware, migrated into the region, they encountered these towering figures and a war began. The Allegawe fought fiercely, but in the end they were driven westward, destroyed, or absorbed. The memory of this war is preserved in story, but also, perhaps, in the mounds that line the Ohio Valley, earthen tombs filled with skeletons that early settlers measured at heights no ordinary man could reach. To the Delaware, the mounds were not mysterious. They were graves, the resting places of the Allegawe their ancestors had defeated. The echo of that war survives in the very name of the Allegheny Mountains, the land forever marked by the giants who once ruled it. The Choctaw, further south, recall a race they called the Nahulo. These were white-skinned giants who lived among them, taller and stronger than ordinary men. Some accounts say they were cannibals, others that they were simply lords who demanded tribute. Either way, the Choctaw memory is clear. They existed, they were feared, and they were eventually destroyed. The Choctaw, like the Delaware, carried their memory not as legend but as history, part of the continuum of their people's story. When the Choctaw looked upon the vast mounds scattered across Mississippi and Alabama, they did not ask who built them. They knew. They were the tombs of the Nahulo, the giants of old. In each of these traditions, giants are not gods or mythical beasts, but human-like beings, flesh and blood, capable of eating, bleeding, marrying, and dying. They are remembered as tall, strong, and often hostile, but never as intangible. Their defeat at the hands of human tribes is remembered with pride as a triumph of ordinary men over extraordinary foes. These stories reinforce what bones and artifacts suggest, that if giants existed, they were not beyond humanity, but a part of it, a parallel branch, a rival lineage that shared the land until they were erased. Archaeological discoveries only sharpen this resonance. The Chippewa tell of wars between red-haired and black-haired giants. Excavations at Lovelock Cave reveal red-haired remains, while skulls found in Ohio mounds show unusual features, some suggesting a different lineage altogether. The Delaware speak of the Elegewi, and indeed, bones far larger than normal have been uncovered along the Ohio Valley, with skulls so massive they could encase a human head. The Choctaw speak of white-skinned giants, and explorers from De Soto to Magellan likewise described towering men with pale complexions, some even with beards, a trait unusual among most native tribes. Skeptics often argue that oral tradition distorts over time, inflating enemies into monsters, exaggerating foes into giants. Yet the consistency of detail across tribes separated by thousands of miles makes this explanation less persuasive. The Delaware, the Choctaw, the Paiute, and the Chippewa had no reason to invent the same features. Red hair, pale skin, unusual height, cannibalistic tendencies. And when their stories align so closely with what explorers wrote in their journals and what miners dug from caves, the result is difficult to ignore. Consider also the persistence of these stories despite pressure to abandon them. As native tribes faced colonization, displacement, and cultural suppression, many of their traditions were lost or silenced. Yet the stories of giants endured, told in whispers around fires, carried into the 20th century by elders like Sarah Winnemucca of the Paiute, who spoke openly of her people's war with the Saite-Ka. These were not tales told for entertainment, but warnings, reminders, affirmations of survival against an enemy that had once been real. In many cases, the oral traditions also contained practical memory, pointing to specific places where battles occurred, caves where giants were entombed, rivers where their names lingered. Archaeologists who dismissed the stories as myth were often surprised to find that excavations in these very places yielded artifacts or remains of unusual size. It was as if the land itself confirmed the memory, echoing back the words of elders through soil and bone. The Chippewa, the Delaware, the Choctaw, each tribe preserved its own version, and when taken together they form a mosaic of testimony stretching across the continent. It is a chorus of voices insisting that giants were real, that they lived among humans, that they fought and died, leaving behind bones buried in the mounds and names carved into rivers and mountains. Whether one believes in the literal existence of such beings or not, the sheer weight of consistent memory demands attention. For when myth converges with archaeology, when story meets bone, the line between history and legend begins to blur. Today, when one stands before the mounds of Ohio or walks through the fields of Mississippi, it is easy to see only earth and grass, to forget that beneath lie the remains of battles remembered in story. But for the tribes whose ancestors fought those battles, the earth still speaks. It holds the memory of the Elegewi, the Nahulo, the Saite-Ka, and the countless others whose names may be lost, but whose presence is not. These giants may have vanished, their bones hidden or destroyed, but in the words of the people who knew them, they live on. And as long as those words are spoken, the giants of America will never truly die. The desert remembers in silence, and Lovelock Cave is perhaps the most haunting silence of all. To the Paiute, it was never just a cave. It was the tomb of their enemies, the final resting place of the red-haired giants they called the Siteka, who had terrorized their ancestors until fire sealed their fate. For centuries, the story lingered, dismissed as folklore by outsiders, a tale told to explain an unusual cave blackened by soot. But in 1911, when two miners named James Hart and David Pugh entered the cavern with picks and shovels, that folklore collided with reality. At first, their goal was guano. Bat droppings, accumulated over millennia, could be sold for fertilizer, and the cave's thick deposits promised a small fortune. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered something stranger than profit. Sandals woven large enough to fit feet twice the size of their own. Duck decoys so skillfully made that even after centuries they seemed ready to float. And human bones, bones that were larger than any they had ever seen. The miners spoke of mummies, desiccated but intact, their skulls bearing tufts of reddish hair. One, they claimed, stood nearly 8 feet tall. The story quickly reached archaeologists, and by 1912 professionals arrived to investigate. The University of California sent Alfred Kroeber, a pioneer in anthropology, who confirmed the presence of artifacts, nets, baskets, tools, but was cautious about the claims of giants. Still, reports from those early excavations mention remains larger than normal, skulls of unusual proportions, and the undeniable evidence of fire at the cave's mouth. The miners insisted that the bodies they had seen before archaeologists arrived were real, mummies unlike any ordinary burial. Yet as professionals took over, those most dramatic finds seemed to vanish. The artifacts were catalogued, stored in small museums, and eventually forgotten by all but a few. The mummies disappeared entirely, their whereabouts never explained. What remains are fragments, sandals so long that no modern man could wear them, woven mats large enough to cover bodies of great size, and the cave itself, its entrance still charred, as if bearing witness to the Paiute story of fire. Visitors can see the blackened rock today, proof of a conflagration at the very spot where legend said the Siteka were destroyed. It is a convergence too sharp to dismiss, myth and material echoing each other across centuries. Yet academic silence descended quickly. The official reports spoke of artifacts, but minimized the claims of giants. The larger bones were said to be misidentified, the red hair explained away as the natural result of chemical changes in mummified hair. The mummies, if they existed, were never displayed. To those outside the academic world, it seemed a familiar pattern. Discovery followed by disappearance, testimony followed by denial. Once again, the most striking evidence slipped into obscurity. The Paiute, however, never wavered. Sarah Winnemucca, daughter of a Paiute chief, spoke openly of her people's war with the Siteka. She even produced a lock of red hair said to be preserved from one of the giants, insisting it was proof of her ancestors' story. To her, and to her tribe, Lovelock Cave was not just an archaeological site, but the confirmation of memory, the place where myth and history became one. That her testimony was brushed aside only deepened the sense of erasure, as if two histories were colliding. The oral truth of a people and the institutional silence of academia. The controversy surrounding Lovelock has grown with time, not diminished. In the late 20th century, researchers revisited the site, hoping to clarify the story. They confirmed the artifacts were ancient, some over 2,000 years old. They catalogued the duck decoys as masterpieces of prehistoric craftsmanship, some of the oldest known in the world. But the question of the giants remained unanswered. Without the mummies, without the bones, there could be no definitive proof. And yet the testimonies persisted. The miners maintained until their deaths that they had seen bodies larger than any man, with red hair still clinging to their skulls. Locals whispered of crates of bones carted away to museums, never to be seen again. The absence itself became evidence, feeding suspicions of a cover-up. Why were the most sensational finds never displayed? Why were the mummies not preserved like other archaeological remains? Was it incompetence? The simple loss of artifacts in an era before standardized preservation? Or was it deliberate, an attempt to suppress evidence that giants had indeed walked the land? For those who believe in the giants, the answer is obvious. Lovelock Cave was the smoking gun, the site where myth and science touched, and its silence today speaks louder than words. For skeptics, the case is more prosaic. They argue the miners exaggerated, that human remains in dry caves often shrink or distort, creating the illusion of abnormal size. They point out that red hair in mummies can result from chemical changes in pigment, not ancestry. They note that giant sandals may have been ceremonial or simply oversized by design. To them, Lovelock is a story inflated by wishful thinking, magnified by the human tendency to make legends from fragments. But skeptics cannot explain away the soot, the precise alignment with Paiute oral tradition, or the sheer number of consistent details across testimonies. Nor can they erase the coincidence that at Spirit Cave, not far from Lovelock, mummies over 9,000 years old were later discovered, their features distinct from local tribes. The land seems to whisper that the Paiute were right, that their story of fire and giants was not invention, but memory. The cave today is quiet, its walls bare, its treasures scattered to distant museums. But for those who stand at its entrance, the blackened rock tells a story louder than silence. Here, perhaps, the last of the Sitaka perished. Here the giants met their end. And here the line between myth and history thins until it nearly vanishes. What Lovelock Cave ultimately represents is not only the mystery of giants, but the mystery of truth itself. How it is remembered, how it is silenced, how it survives. The miners' picks may have unearthed bones, but what they truly uncovered was a fissure in the narrative of America's past, a crack that shows another story beneath. Whether giants truly lay there, or whether the cave magnified smaller truths into legends, the fact remains. Lovelock refuses to let us forget. It remains one of the most enduring enigmas of the American desert, a place where the shadows of giants still linger, waiting for the courage to be acknowledged. As the new century dawned, the giants had not yet been erased from memory. Newspapers still carried reports of skeletons unearthed by farmers plowing fields, construction crews cutting roads, or amateur archaeologists probing the earthworks that dotted the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Each discovery seemed to reaffirm what the old explorers, the native tribes, and even Lincoln himself had once declared, that America was built on the bones of a race now gone. But these reports, though sensational, almost always ended the same way. with sudden disappearance, with silence, with bones that crumbled or were carted away, leaving only headlines and whispers in their wake. In 1912, on the shores of Lake Delavan in Wisconsin, workers excavating a burial mound made a discovery that electrified the region. Beneath the soil lay the skeletons of men and women measuring between 7 and 9 feet in height. But their size was not the only astonishing detail. Many of the skulls bore a peculiar feature: double rows of teeth, a duplication that made their jaws grotesquely strong, as if designed for something beyond ordinary human chewing. To the workers and onlookers, the bones were not only evidence of giants, but of giants unlike any they had imagined, their very biology marking them as a separate race. The New York Times reported the find on May 4, 1912, describing the skeletons as a lost tribe of prehistoric giants. The story spread quickly, then faded into silence. The skeletons themselves vanished, leaving only the article as proof they had ever been seen. Similar stories emerged elsewhere. In the Midwest, farmers digging wells uncovered skulls so large that a man could place his head inside. In some, the peculiar trait of double rows of teeth appeared again, a detail too strange to be coincidence. These were not isolated finds, but part of a pattern, recurring across states and decades, suggesting that among the giants, certain physical traits, height, strength, unusual dentition, were consistent. Some accounts described jawbones that could slip over the head of a normal man like a mask, skulls thick as helmets, and teeth lined in ways that seemed almost predatory. Local communities often greeted these finds with awe and unease. For some, the giants were proof of biblical stories, evidence that the Nephilim of Genesis had once lived in America. Ministers used the discoveries in sermons, pointing to the bones as vindication of Scripture. For others, the giants were simply a marvel, a reminder that the land still held secrets deeper than any settler had imagined. Children gathered to see the bones displayed at fairs or in small-town museums, their imaginations fired by the thought of men who had stood twice as tall as their fathers. Yet always, the story ended the same. The bones would be sent to universities or to Washington, often to the Smithsonian, and never seen again. For the people who witnessed them, the vanishing was as mysterious as the discovery itself. Why, they asked, were these remains not preserved and studied? Why did institutions so eagerly collect them only to lock them away? Some suspected negligence, that the fragile bones crumbled when exposed to air. Others suspected something more deliberate, that the giants were being erased because they did not fit the official narrative of history. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Again and again, discoveries of giant skeletons were followed by disappearance. One cannot help but imagine the scene at Lake Delavan. Workers sweating in the spring sun, soil piled high, the sudden astonishment as a massive skull rolled from the earth, jaws lined with teeth upon teeth. The murmurs of the crowd, the awe of those who beheld the bones, the quiet fear that these were not just tall men, but something other. And then, the arrival of officials, the removal of the skeletons, the silence that followed. To those who saw them, the memory endured for a lifetime. To history, they were gone within weeks. Double rows of teeth are not a trivial detail. In medical literature, cases of hyperdontia, extra teeth, are rare but real, usually involving 1 or 2 additional teeth, not full duplicate rows. For multiple skulls across states to show this feature suggests something unique, perhaps even genetic, a trait of a distinct population. Skeptics dismiss the reports as exaggerations, misinterpretations of damaged skulls. But the persistence of the detail, repeated by farmers, workers, journalists, and townsfolk who had no connection to one another, raises questions. Why would so many invent the same anomaly? The Midwest, with its rolling hills and ancient mounds, became a landscape of whispers. Farmers plowing fields turned up giant bones. Children stumbled upon oversized skulls along riverbanks. Small-town papers recorded these discoveries in matter-of-fact tones, as if such marvels were extraordinary but not impossible. They were presented not as hoaxes, but as curiosities, part of the wonder of a land still revealing itself. The Smithsonian's name appears often in these stories, a presence both reassuring and suspicious, for when the bones were handed over, they rarely returned. To those who lived in these towns, the giants were not abstract. They were real, tangible, bodies unearthed before their eyes. They were part of the land's story, and when they disappeared, the people felt a loss, not only of relics, but of truth. For them, the erasure was a wound, a reminder that the past was being hidden even as it tried to reveal itself. The bones of Lake Delavan, the double-toothed skulls of Ohio, the massive skeletons of Wisconsin. All these discoveries belong now to the silence. They are gone, but their stories remain, carried in articles, in family tales, in the faint memory of communities that once gazed upon giants. Their absence only deepens the mystery, for absence speaks. It tells us that something was there, something too troubling to preserve. The Midwest today is quiet, its fields golden with corn, its rivers winding gently. The mounds lie under trees, grass-covered, their secrets sealed. Yet beneath, perhaps, still lie bones of extraordinary size, waiting for the day when they can be unearthed again. The giants may be gone from museums, but they are not gone from the land. They remain in the soil, in the memory of those who saw them, in the stories that refuse to die. And as long as those stories are told, the giants live on, their shadows stretching across the prairies, reminding us that history is not a closed book, but a living mystery, still unfolding beneath our feet. By the early decades of the 20th century, the stories of giants had begun to slip from the pages of newspapers into something stranger and more enduring. The imagination of a people searching for meaning in their past. The bones had vanished, the mummies gone, the artifacts dispersed or declared mundane, yet the tales refused to fade. They resurfaced in churches, in revival tents, in hushed conversations among farmers and miners who had seen too much to believe the official denials. What had once been reported as news was becoming something more resilient, folklore mixed with faith, memory mixed with suspicion. The Bible provided fertile ground for this transformation. In the book of Genesis, before the flood, there were the Nephilim, giants born of the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. They were described as mighty men of renown, beings who filled the earth with violence. Later books spoke of Goliath, of Og the king of Bashan, of races of giants who were driven out or destroyed by the Israelites. For many in America, the discovery of oversized bones in the mounds of Ohio or the deserts of Nevada was nothing less than confirmation that these scriptural accounts were true. To hold a femur, the length of a man's body, was to see the Bible made flesh. Preachers seized on the finds. Sermons thundered that God's word was vindicated in the soil of America, that the mounds themselves bore witness to the truth of ancient scripture. Revivalists declared that the Nephilim had walked the New World just as surely as they had the Old, and that their destruction proved the righteousness of divine judgment. To congregations weary of industrial change and modern skepticism, the giants were a bridge between faith and evidence, between the ancient world of the Bible and the new world they inhabited. But not everyone found comfort in this interpretation. For others, the giants were troubling, unsettling, a crack in the neat surface of history. If the Bible was right about giants, what else might it be right about? And if institutions like the Smithsonian were hiding bones, what else might they be hiding? Out of these questions grew the first whispers of conspiracy, of deliberate erasure, of a cover-up so deep it reshaped the story of humanity itself. The idea of a hidden history was intoxicating. Newspapers that once printed straightforward reports of giant skeletons now began to hint at suppression. Writers claimed that hundreds of skeletons had been quietly taken to Washington, only to vanish into basements never to be seen again. Farmers who had once displayed bones at county fairs told their children that men in suits had arrived, promising to preserve the remains, only to leave them with silence. Families passed down stories of great-grandfathers who had uncovered skulls bigger than kettles, only to be told by officials that such things must not be spoken of again. In this environment, the giants became more than a curiosity. They became symbols of distrust, evidence that those in power were controlling not only the present but the past. At a time when America was expanding its institutions, when science was asserting its authority over folk belief, the giants became the rallying point for those who refused to surrender memory to authority. They stood for the possibility that history was not as neat as textbooks claimed, that there were truths buried beneath layers of denial. The connection to the Nephilim deepened the sense of danger. In biblical tradition, the Nephilim were not merely tall men, but a transgressive race, born of unions that blurred the line between heaven and earth. To some, this suggested that the giants were more than human, perhaps even the offspring of beings from beyond the world. Fringe voices began to speculate that the giants were evidence of ancient visitors, whether angels, fallen or otherwise, or even beings from other realms. The strangeness of their traits, the double rows of teeth, the red hair, the massive skulls, seemed to support the idea that they were not simply tall men, but something other. In rural communities, where church and newspaper were the main sources of truth, this blending of scripture and rumor gave birth to a powerful narrative. The giants were real. They had been destroyed by God or man, and their remains were being hidden to prevent the people from realizing that the Bible was true and that history was far more complex than scholars admitted. This suspicion hardened into a kind of folklore conspiracy, retold in parlors and pulpits, gaining strength from every vanished bone, every missing mummy, every unanswered question. By the mid-20th century, this folklore began to bleed into the broader culture. Popular writers speculated about giants in magazines, connecting them not only to the Bible, but to myths around the world. The Titans of Greece, the Jötnar of Norse sagas, the Rakshasa of India. They argued that all these traditions pointed to a universal memory of a race of beings larger and stronger than men. To a public hungry for wonder in an age of mechanization, these arguments carried weight. The giants were no longer just America's secret. They were humanity's. And in the background, the silence of institutions only fueled the fire. The Smithsonian never offered clear explanations for the missing skeletons. Museums avoided the subject. Archaeologists dismissed it with a wave of the hand. The absence of transparency became, in itself, a kind of evidence, confirming for many that there was something to hide. The giants became a mirror for cultural unease, reflecting both the longing for connection to ancient truths and the suspicion that modern authority was dishonest. The persistence of the giant narrative shows how deeply it resonated. It tied together disparate threads: the Bible, the Mounds, the explorers' journals, the tribal legends, the vanished bones. It offered a story at once mysterious and affirming, frightening and empowering. For believers, it proved that history was vaster than admitted. For skeptics, it became an example of how myths endure even when evidence fades. But either way, the giants remained, walking through memory, refusing to be forgotten. In the end, perhaps the most enduring impact of the giants was not the bones themselves, but the questions they left behind. Were the mounds merely the work of Native Americans, or the graves of another race? Were the giants Nephilim, echoes of the Bible's oldest stories, or were they simply tall men elevated by fear and wonder into monsters? Were the institutions that silenced the discoveries protecting the truth, or protecting themselves from ridicule? These questions, unanswered, became the seed of modern conspiracy thinking, the belief that history itself was being rewritten by unseen hands. The giants of America were no longer just bones in the ground. They had become emblems of secrecy, symbols of the hidden, reminders that truth is fragile and can be lost not only through time, but through intent. And so, in churches and living rooms, in pulpits and bar rooms, in yellowed newspaper clippings and fading memory, the giants lived on. They were no longer simply skeletons. They were warnings, questions, mysteries, and for some, proof that the world was larger, stranger, and older than anyone dared to admit. By the middle of the 20th century, the giants had all but vanished from mainstream archaeology. University courses no longer mentioned them, museums offered no exhibits, and the Smithsonian spoke of them only in terms of misidentification and exaggeration. To the official eye, they were nothing more than curiosities of the past, tall tales spun by farmers and frontier reporters. Yet outside the polished walls of academia, the story of the giants refused to die. Instead, it took on a new life, reshaped by a culture that was itself in the throes of transformation. The post-war years were a time of fascination with the unknown. Flying saucers danced across headlines, mysterious lights were reported in the skies of New Mexico, and the modern UFO era was born. In this atmosphere of wonder and suspicion, the old stories of giants began to fuse with new narratives of ancient visitors, suppressed truths, and hidden history. The line between archaeology and science fiction blurred, and in that blur, the giants found a new home. Writers began to argue that the giants were not merely a lost race of humans, but perhaps the offspring of something far stranger. They pointed to the biblical Nephilim, born of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and suggested that this language might describe extraterrestrial beings interbreeding with humans. To them, the double rows of teeth, the immense stature, the red hair and pale skin were evidence of genetic manipulation, signs that these were not ordinary men, but hybrids created by forces beyond the earth. The giants, they claimed, were the first proof that humanity's past had been guided or interfered with by visitors from the stars. This idea was electrifying. Books like Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods would later popularize the ancient astronaut theory, arguing that monuments like the pyramids or Stonehenge bore the fingerprints of alien technology. But before that wave crested, American enthusiasts of suppressed archaeology were already connecting the dots. The Lovelock mummies, the Spirit caveman, the skeletons of the Ohio Mounds, all were evidence of beings who did not fit the neat box of human history. Their disappearance into institutional silence was seen as deliberate, a cover-up meant to keep humanity from realizing that its origins were stranger, perhaps even extraterrestrial. In dusty libraries and small-town bookstores, self-published pamphlets circulated, blending archaeology with conspiracy. They spoke of secret vaults beneath the Smithsonian, warehouses filled with bones never displayed. They told of government officials who arrived at dig sites to confiscate remains. They hinted that anyone who pressed too hard would be silenced, their careers destroyed, their findings discredited. For those who distrusted authority in an age of Cold War secrecy and nuclear fear, these stories rang true. The giants, once the province of explorers and farmers, had become symbols of resistance against official narratives. They stood for the possibility that history was being rewritten by unseen hands, that truth was not lost by accident, but by design. In this new context, the giants were no longer only the enemies of the Paiute or the marvels of Patagonia. They were the hidden heritage of humanity, stolen from the people by institutions that sought control. The blending of giants with UFO lore produced strange hybrids of story. Some claimed that the red-haired mummies of Lovelock were the descendants of extraterrestrial colonists, stranded on Earth in antiquity. Others argued that the Spirit caveman's unusual skull shape was evidence of alien ancestry. A few even suggested that the giants were not extinct at all, that remnants of them survived in remote places, the origin of legends like Bigfoot or Sasquatch. In these tellings, the giants were not only part of the past, but part of the present, lurking in shadows, glimpsed on lonely roads, the living proof that the official story was incomplete. For many, this was too much speculation, too much fantasy. But the giants thrived in this environment precisely because they existed in the borderland between fact and myth. The artifacts were real. The mounds were real. The old newspaper reports were real. That these pieces were then woven into tapestries of UFOs and ancient astronauts did not diminish their power. If anything, it made them more resilient, embedding them in the growing mythology of a world hungry for mystery. By the 1960s and 70s, the giants had become part of the countercultural imagination. As distrust in government deepened, as Vietnam and Watergate eroded public faith, the idea that history itself was being suppressed seemed less absurd. If politicians could lie about wars and spies, why not about bones? The giants fit neatly into this new skepticism, evidence not only of a stranger past but of a dishonest present. They were proof that the people were being denied their heritage, that power thrived on erasure. At the same time, spiritual seekers drew new meanings from the giants. To some, they represented fallen angels, reminders that the material world was always shadowed by the spiritual. To others, they were symbols of human potential, evidence that humanity had once been greater, taller, stronger, and that the present age was a diminished echo of the past. The giants became metaphors as much as mysteries, embodying both fear and hope, both menace and possibility. Academic silence only fueled this transformation. Every unanswered question became a seed for speculation. Every vanished bone became a symbol of secrecy. Every story dismissed as folklore was embraced as hidden truth. The giants thrived not because they were proven, but because they were denied. They survived because they were buried, literally and figuratively, beneath layers of silence. And in that silence, the imagination of a restless age filled the void. By the close of the 20th century, the giants had become fixtures of the alternative history movement, appearing in books, radio shows, and eventually television programs that asked whether ancient aliens had guided humanity. They stood alongside Atlantis, pyramids, and UFO crashes at Roswell, part of a constellation of mysteries that promised a world larger than the one taught in classrooms. And though scholars scoffed, the giants endured because they offered something the textbooks did not. Wonder, depth, the sense that beneath the surface of the familiar lay a hidden epic of forgotten races and suppressed truths. In this way, the giants stepped out of the soil and into culture itself. They were no longer only bones and skulls, but ideas, living presences in the minds of those who longed for mystery. Whether seen as Nephilim, hybrids, aliens, or simply a lost race of men, they remained unyielding in their power to disturb and inspire. And as the 20th century marched on, their story was ready to be carried into a new age of media, where their shadows would stretch further still, reaching from the mounds and caves into the glowing screens of millions. As the 20th century waned and the new millennium drew near, the giants that had once been spoken of in journals, newspapers, and tribal councils began to find a new stage. The glowing screens of television, the pages of mass-market paperbacks, and eventually the endless sprawl of the internet. What had once been reported as news, and later whispered as rumor, now became entertainment. Myth packaged for a culture hungry for lost worlds and forbidden truths. The giants, once confined to dusty archives and oral traditions, walked again. Not in flesh, but in stories retold to millions. It began with books. In the 1960s and 70s, when the counterculture challenged authority and mistrusted official narratives, writers outside the academy began to stitch together the scattered fragments of giant lore. They compiled old newspaper clippings, explorers' journals, native traditions, and half-forgotten excavation reports, weaving them into narratives that declared the existence of a race deliberately erased from history. Titles appeared in paperback racks, promising revelations of lost races, forbidden archaeology, and the bones of giants hidden in vaults. For readers who felt alienated by the sterile tone of academic history, these books offered color and wonder. They did not simply describe artifacts, but suggested a grand conspiracy, a cover-up that transformed curiosity into outrage. By the 1990s, this current of alternative history had become a flood. Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods had already made ancient aliens a household idea, and into that current the giants slipped easily. If extraterrestrials had guided the building of pyramids in Egypt, why could they not also have fathered a race of giants in America? If the Nazca lines were runways for alien craft, why could the Serpent Mound not be a monument to beings taller than men? Authors like Zecharia Sitchin connected the biblical Nephilim to the Anunnaki, gods of Mesopotamia whom he interpreted as alien visitors, and claimed that the giants were their offspring, laborers or lords placed upon the earth. In his retelling, the double-toothed skulls of the Midwest and the red-haired mummies of Lovelock became not anomalies, but evidence of genetic manipulation by beings from the stars. Television soon amplified these ideas. Documentary channels once devoted to sober history turned to sensational mysteries to capture viewers. Programs asked, "Did giants really walk America?" They showed recreations of mounds, caves, and skeletons, their narration solemn, their music eerie. The absence of bones was reframed as part of the mystery, the silence of institutions portrayed as evidence of suppression. Millions who had never read a single archaeological report now heard of the Lovelock giants, the Spirit Cave mummy, the San Diego Colossus. The giants had become characters in a drama of lost history, beamed into living rooms across the world. The internet gave the story yet another rebirth. Online forums and blogs in the early 2000s became repositories of old newspaper clippings, scanned and shared, sometimes crudely, but always with passion. Images of giant skeletons circulated, some authentic photographs from old digs, others crude digital fakes. But to those who longed for confirmation, the distinction hardly mattered. The internet flattened the line between verified history and speculation, and in that flatness, the giants thrived. Every missing bone became a cover-up, every odd skull a relic of the Nephilim, every mound a forgotten monument. Videos claiming to show giant remains in Iraq or Afghanistan circulated widely, some debunked, others endlessly recycled. The giants were no longer confined to the past. They were said to have been found by soldiers overseas, their bones secretly shipped back under the cover of war. For many, this shift turned the giants into something larger than archaeology. They became symbols of a suppressed alternative past, evidence that the story humanity had been told about itself was incomplete. The giants represented not only the erasure of bones, but the erasure of wonder, the loss of a deeper truth about human origins. Whether framed in biblical terms as Nephilim, in conspiratorial terms as Smithsonian suppression, or in cosmic terms as alien hybrids, the giants stood for resistance to official narratives. To believe in them was to declare that history was bigger, stranger, and richer than textbooks allowed. Yet within this new visibility came distortion. The giants who once danced on Patagonian shores, who once fought the Paiute in the Nevada desert, who once filled the mounds of Ohio, became caricatures in memes and sensational shows. Their stories were cut from context, their cultural weight as ancestral enemies or revered beings flattened into spectacle. What had once been the living memory of tribes and the astonishment of explorers was now fodder for entertainment. For some, this cheapened the giants, turning them into fantasies. For others, it only strengthened their allure. After all, if television and the internet mocked them, perhaps it was because the truth was too dangerous to admit. Through all this, the actual sites remained. The Serpent Mound still coils across Ohio. Lovelock Cave still bears its scars of fire. Spirit Cave still lies silent in Nevada. Cahokia's great mounds still rise over the Mississippi floodplain. These places do not vanish with time. They are there for anyone willing to look, monuments that whisper of a past we do not fully understand. And as long as they stand, the giants cannot be wholly forgotten, no matter how they are reshaped by media. In the 21st century, the giants occupy a strange place between folklore, conspiracy, and popular myth. They are not taught in classrooms, yet they are spoken of in documentaries, on podcasts, in endless videos that rehash the same clippings and rumors. They are not displayed in museums, yet they are etched into landscapes and stories. They are both everywhere and nowhere, present in imagination, but absent in evidence. And perhaps that is precisely why they endure. The giants of America are not only a question of archaeology, but of identity. They ask whether humanity is willing to face a past that is not neat, not tidy, not easily explained. They ask whether we are willing to listen to voices outside institutions, to tribal elders, to farmers, to miners, to presidents who once spoke of bones in the mounds. They remind us that truth is not always what survives in official records, but what lingers in memory, in whispers, in landscapes that refuse to forget. As the world entered the new millennium, the giants walked again, not in flesh, but in screens, in words, in suspicions that history itself had been rewritten. They had become more than bones. They had become symbols, and in a world hungering for mystery, that was enough to make them immortal. The 21st century has brought with it a revolution in the way we see the past. Where 19th century explorers wielded only shovels and tape measures, today's archaeologists command satellites, lasers, and machines capable of reading the codes written in bones. The Earth can no longer keep its secrets so easily. Forests yield their hidden cities under the sweep of LiDAR beams. DNA, coiled inside the smallest fragment of bone, speaks after 10,000 years of silence. With every new tool, history expands, and in that expansion the shadow of the giants stirs again. One of the most profound shifts came with the use of genetic analysis. For decades, the Spirit Cave mummies lay in limbo, claimed by the Paiute Shoshone tribe, but contested by scientists who argued that their features were unlike any known native group. When advanced DNA sequencing finally became possible, tests were run. The results stunned both sides. The Spirit Cave man was, genetically, Native American. Yet his features remained unusual, his skull shape distinct, his presence still unsettling. To scientists, this proved continuity, that the first peoples of America were more diverse than imagined. But to those who clung to the memory of giants, it was further proof that physical traits do not always align with simple categories, that a race of unusual beings could have mingled and vanished while leaving traces in the genes of today. Other remains have yielded similar puzzles. In burial sites across the continent, DNA testing has revealed lineages that diverge from expected patterns, suggesting multiple waves of migration into the Americas, some as early as 20,000 years ago. If giants existed, could they have been one of these waves? Distinct, powerful, now extinct? The possibility lingers, fed not only by bones, but by the very structure of human diversity. While genetics probes the micro, LiDAR transforms the macro. In the jungles of Central and South America, planes equipped with laser technology have stripped away the forest canopy to reveal vast forgotten cities, temples, roads, terraces, all hidden for centuries under green. In Honduras, a lost city revealed by LiDAR showed monumental earthworks larger than scholars expected. In Guatemala, a network of Mayan cities appeared, their complexity rewriting assumptions about the scale of ancient life. And though no giant skeletons were found, the sheer scale of these constructions hints at societies capable of feats once dismissed as impossible. To believers, it is another echo. If the mounds of Ohio and the serpent's coils could be built, why not by the hands of men larger than ourselves? The Midwest, too, has begun to yield secrets through modern technology. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed burial chambers beneath mounds never before opened, confirming that these were not random earthworks but deliberate, sophisticated constructions. Some chambers appear large enough to house bodies bigger than ordinary men. Archaeologists, cautious, rarely speak of giants. But those who follow the trail see the outlines of an old story flickering beneath the soil. What modern tools have not found are the missing bones, the skulls and skeletons reported in newspapers a century ago, the crates said to have been carted to Washington, the mummies of Lovelock whispered of by miners. Yet absence, in this new era, is itself provocative. Why, if these bones were truly hoaxes, are they not displayed as curiosities? Why are they not shown as mistakes, the better to educate the public? Why, instead, are they simply gone? The silence of institutions continues to feed suspicion, and every new advance in technology only sharpens the hunger for answers. Meanwhile, popular culture has kept pace. As DNA and LiDAR rewrite history, television and digital media echo the developments with their own speculation. Programs link the discoveries of vast ancient cities to the legends of giants, suggesting that only men of immense size could have moved such stones, carved such mounds, or commanded such labor. Scientists insist that human ingenuity is enough. But the suspicion lingers. What if those old stories, those oral traditions of giant builders, were not allegory but memory? The giants, in this context, have become a kind of ghost presence in archaeology. They do not appear directly, yet they haunt the edges of every discovery that strains the bounds of accepted history. When LiDAR reveals a Mayan city larger than London, the giants are there in the whispers of those who say such scale demands more than human effort. When DNA reveals lineages stretching back beyond the Bering Strait, the giants are there in the question of what other peoples crossed into the continent. When mounds are mapped and their chambers detected but not opened, the giants are there, imagined in the shadows. Even mainstream scientists acknowledge that the story of America's first peoples is far more complex than once believed. The old model of a single migration 12,000 years ago has crumbled. Now there is talk of multiple waves, of seafarers reaching the coasts, of ice corridors opening and closing, of diversity beyond measure. Into this complexity, the giants slip easily, less as proven fact than as unanswered possibility. If history is not neat, then who is to say that among those waves there were not men taller, stronger, stranger than ourselves? Technology has also given new weight to old artifacts. The sandals from Lovelock Cave, preserved in museum drawers, have been measured at over 15 inches long, evidence not of myth, but of craftsmanship. Duck decoys, nets, and woven mats speak of a people with skill and sophistication, whoever they were. Yet their connection to the Paiute legend of giants keeps the suspicion alive. Were these the belongings of ordinary men, or of the red-haired marauders remembered in story? The tools remain, the bodies do not. The gap between artifact and absence is a chasm filled by imagination. And so, the 21st century has not ended the story of giants. If anything, it has deepened it. For every answer DNA provides, more questions arise. For every city revealed by LiDAR, new mysteries emerge. For every mound scanned by radar, there is the temptation to dig, to see, to know. The giants may never be proven by the standards of science, but they remain proven by the persistence of memory, by the unwillingness of stories to fade, by the way each new discovery brushes against their shadow. Standing at the edge of Spirit Cave, one feels this tension. The bones have been tested, their genetics declared, their age astonishing. Yet the strangeness of their features, the silence of their story, refuses to resolve. The cave holds both the power of science and the echo of legend, and between them, the giants remain. The new tools of archaeology do not silence the past, they amplify it, and in their light, the giants walk again, not as skeletons, but as questions, pressing harder than ever. Who truly walked this land, and why has their memory been buried? The story of giants is not bound by the borders of America. If anything, the tales unearthed from the deserts of Nevada and the mounds of Ohio echo a much larger chorus, one sung across continents and millennia. Everywhere humanity has left its mark, there seem to be stories of men and women too large for the ordinary world, remembered in scripture, mythology, and stone. This global persistence raises a tantalizing question. Are these traditions mere coincidence, or are they fragments of a single memory, scattered like shards across cultures? The Hebrew Bible speaks of the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the Nephilim, races of giants who dwelt in Canaan long before the Israelites entered the land. When scouts were sent to spy out the promised land, they returned trembling, saying, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Among these giants was Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed was described as 9 cubits long, over 13 feet. The Bible does not treat these figures as metaphors, but as historical foes, fought in battles, slain by men. The giants are woven into sacred history, not as allegories, but as flesh and blood adversaries, the memory of a race that stood apart. In Greece, the echoes resound again. The Titans, primal beings who warred against the Olympian gods, were not ethereal spirits but embodied forces, immense and powerful. Later came the Gigantes, who rose against the gods in the gigantomachy, their bodies so vast that they could hurl mountains as weapons. The Greeks remembered them not as myths detached from place, but as beings whose bodies, they believed, lay beneath certain hills and volcanic plains. Earthquakes were said to be the stirrings of giants buried under the land. The overlap with America's mounds, hills said to cover the bones of giants, is uncanny, as though distant cultures looked upon the same phenomenon and clothed it in their own tongues. Further east, in India, the Rakshasa of ancient epics were described as towering beings, some benevolent, others malevolent, engaged in endless war with men and gods alike. In Norse tradition, the Jutnar, often called frost giants, were ancient beings who preceded even the gods, forces of nature embodied in massive form. In Polynesia, tales persist of men so tall they could pluck coconuts without climbing, builders of stone monuments too immense for ordinary hands. Across the world, the memory repeats. Beings of unusual size, always at the threshold of history and myth. South America provides some of the most striking parallels. In Peru, Spanish chroniclers reported that the native people spoke of giants who had once landed on their coasts in reed boats. These giants, they said, were so tall that an ordinary man reached only to their knees. They ravaged the land, devoured the people, and were finally destroyed by a fire from heaven. Archaeologists in Peru have unearthed megalithic stone blocks at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo, cut and fitted with such precision that even modern engineers puzzle over them. The stones weigh dozens, sometimes hundreds of tons, their edges carved to interlock as if molded like clay. To the native traditions, these were the works of Viracochas, sometimes interpreted as gods, sometimes as giants. The resemblance to America's mound builder legends is difficult to miss. Earth in the north, stone in the south, but in both cases, monuments too massive for easy explanation, attributed to beings larger than ourselves. Even in Patagonia, where Magellan's sailors first spoke of giants, the native Tehuelche preserved their own traditions of men twice the height of ordinary mortals. To them, the giants were not fables but ancestral memory, beings who had walked the same plains the Spanish now crossed. When European explorers described seeing them with their own eyes, it was less a discovery than a confirmation of what the local people had always known. Skeptics argue that these similarities arise from the human tendency to exaggerate, to transform tall or powerful foes into giants in story. But if that is true, why do so many traditions include the same peculiar details? The red hair of Nevada's Siteca matches the descriptions of fair-haired Viracochas in the Andes. The cannibalism of the Paiute legends echoes in the stories of giants in Canaan and Peru. The burial of giants under mounds in America mirrors the entombment of giants beneath hills in Greece, and the battles between men and beings twice their size appear in every corner of the globe. Coincidence alone begins to feel inadequate. What if these are not independent inventions, but fragments of a single memory carried outward as humanity spread? If a distinct population of unusually tall people once existed, they may have wandered with the same migrations that carried humanity across continents. Some settled in the Americas, others in Canaan, others in Peru. Over time, they dwindled, destroyed by war or absorbed into smaller populations until only their bones and stories remained. The world, divided by oceans, preserved the same echo in different tongues. Modern archaeology, in its search for the origins of civilization, has revealed how interconnected the ancient world may have been. Seafaring was not as rare as once thought. Contacts across thousands of miles are increasingly plausible. In this context, the repetition of giant stories becomes less mysterious. The memory may have spread along with trade, migration, and conflict. Or perhaps, more daringly, it did not need to spread at all, because everywhere people truly encountered such beings. The global parallels also highlight a curious pattern. Giants are rarely remembered as peaceful. They are destroyers, tyrants, cannibals, enemies of gods and men alike. And yet, they are also builders, credited with monuments too immense for ordinary hands. They are both feared and revered, hated and remembered. The ambiguity suggests that humanity's relationship with giants was complex, shaped by both awe and struggle. To defeat them was a source of pride, yet to erase their memory entirely was impossible, for their works remained too large, their bones too numerous, their stories too enduring. The giants of America, then, do not stand alone. They are part of a tapestry that stretches from the mountains of Peru to the plains of Bashan, from the myths of Greece to the jungles of Polynesia. They are the universal shadow of humanity, always at the edge of memory, always too large to ignore. Their global presence does not prove their existence, but it does prove their persistence in every culture, in every land, in every attempt to remember who we once were. And so the question grows larger. If giants were merely myth, why are they everywhere? If they were only exaggerations, why do the details match across oceans? And if they were real, then what does that say about our own place in history? That we were not alone, that we once shared the earth with others, beings who walked taller, lived stronger, and left behind a silence we have yet to fill? In America, the story of giants has always carried more than bones. Beneath every report of an oversized skeleton or a mummy with red hair lies a deeper tension, one about identity and ownership of the past. For the native peoples, giants have long been remembered as foes or predecessors, part of the living landscape of their history. For European settlers, the discovery of giant bones in mounds seemed to confirm biblical stories, offering a bridge between Old World scripture and New World soil. And for the institutions that rose in the 19th century, the Smithsonian, foremost among them, the giants threatened to disrupt a carefully constructed narrative of who belonged to this land and how its history should be told. The United States was, from its earliest days, invested in the story of being a new world, distinct from the tangled histories of Europe. The great mounds of the Midwest, when first surveyed, presented a problem. They were vast, complex, and ancient. If the native tribes were their builders, then the sophistication of indigenous civilization was undeniable, and the new nation would have to reckon with the fact that the land it occupied was not empty wilderness, but the site of ancient achievement. If, on the other hand, the mounds were attributed to a lost race, perhaps even giants, then settlers could imagine themselves as heirs to a mysterious lineage that had vanished long before. Both options were powerful, but they clashed, and in that clash, giants became political. The erasure of giants from official history coincided with the effort to frame Native Americans as both noble and doomed, heirs to a vanished past, but not equal to the grandeur of what the land once held. John Wesley Powell and others argued that the mounds were built by native ancestors, an effort to give them dignity within an isolationist framework. But if reports of giant skeletons were admitted, the framework cracked. Were these giants native? Were they another race? Were they proof of biblical Nephilim, or of an old world connection that undermined the idea of American isolation? Any of these options disrupted the clean story institutions wanted to tell. So the bones disappeared, and the official line hardened. For native tribes, the silence was doubly wounding. Their oral histories, which spoke of wars against giants, were dismissed as myth, even as their sacred sites were looted. The Paiute told of burning the Sitaka in Lovelock Cave, yet when mummies with red hair were found there, scholars ignored their testimony. The Delaware told of driving out the Alijewi, yet when giant bones were found in the Ohio Valley, their story was not credited. The Choctaw spoke of the Nahulo, white-skinned giants who once oppressed them. Yet when skeletons of unusual stature were unearthed, their words were dismissed. It was as though the land itself confirmed their memories, but institutions chose silence rather than acknowledgement. This dynamic continues into the present. When DNA testing of the Spirit Cave mummy revealed native ancestry, the government returned the remains to the Paiute Shoshone tribe for reburial. To scientists, this was closure, proof of continuity. To the tribe, it was vindication. Yet the story also silenced the strangeness, the unusual skull shape, the immense age, the uncanny resemblance to the giants of Paiute lore. Science had spoken, but memory remained unsettled. For the tribe, Spirit Cave was not simply evidence of ancestry, but a reminder of their history with beings unlike themselves, enemies who had once walked the desert. That their story continues to be treated as allegory rather than testimony reveals how deeply the denial still runs. In modern America, giants also resonate with questions of nationalism. To those who see them through a biblical lens, they affirm that America is part of a sacred history, that its soil contains proof of Scripture. To those who distrust institutions, they prove that government and academia collude to hide the truth. To indigenous peoples, they remain part of a living heritage, often distorted by outsiders but never forgotten within their own traditions. Giants thus stand at the intersection of faith, suspicion, and memory, symbols both of pride and erasure. The rise of alternative history movements has amplified this symbolism. In podcasts, documentaries, and internet forums, giants are cast as evidence of a suppressed America, an America whose true past has been hidden from its people. They are invoked as reminders that the land holds secrets too vast for textbooks, that the official story is incomplete. In this way, giants have become not only a subject of curiosity but a form of resistance, a way of asserting that truth belongs to the people, not to institutions. And yet, the giants are not simply tools for conspiracy. They are also bridges. They link America to the global chorus of giant traditions, reminding us that the land is part of a larger human story. They link native oral histories to archaeology, forcing us to reconsider the weight of indigenous memory. They link presidents like Lincoln, who spoke of their bones at Niagara, to ordinary farmers who dug them from fields. In their persistence, giants refuse to be claimed by any single narrative. They belong to all, and in belonging to all, they unsettle every boundary. Today, when one walks the mounds of Cahokia, climbs the Serpent's Coils in Ohio, or stands before the blackened entrance of Lovelock Cave, the silence is heavy. These places are not simply archaeological sites, but contested spaces, where myth and history collide, where memory and denial coexist. They are reminders that history is not only written in books, but etched into land, carried in story, whispered in silence. The giants may never be proven to the satisfaction of science, but their presence in culture, memory, and identity is undeniable. They are part of America's hidden history, not because they are unseen, but because they are unacknowledged. They live in the gap between indigenous testimony and institutional silence, between bones reported and bones lost, between memory and denial. And as long as that gap remains, the giants will continue to walk the American imagination, larger than life, impossible to bury. The story of America's giants is not a straight road. It bends and doubles back, a path that begins with the journals of astonished explorers and leads through tribal memories into the mounds of the Midwest, the caves of Nevada, the headlines of the 19th century, and the vaults of vanished evidence. Along the way, it branches into the Bible and into myth, into speculation about alien visitors, and into the stubborn silence of institutions. To follow it is to wander in a labyrinth of echoes, where every turn reveals another voice insisting that giants once walked the earth, and another wall of denial insisting they did not. The explorers saw them. Magellan in Patagonia, Drake's men along the coast, Spanish chroniclers in Peru, all wrote of men taller than any they had known, their hair red, their strength remarkable. The tribes remembered them. The Paiute spoke of the Sea-Teka, burned alive in Lovelock Cave. The Delaware remembered driving the Allegewee from the Ohio Valley. The Choctaw told of the Nahulo, pale-skinned giants who demanded tribute. The Chippewa spoke of red-haired giants who fought black-haired rivals. To them, the giants were not myth but memory, part of the landscape of survival. The land itself seemed to agree. Mounds rose from the earth, not random but deliberate, tombs that yielded bones too large to belong to ordinary men. Caves gave up sandals 15 inches long, mummies with tufts of red hair, skulls with double rows of teeth. Newspapers recorded these finds with sober awe, their headlines declaring the discovery of ancient giants. Presidents like Abraham Lincoln spoke of them as accepted fact. Farmers displayed their bones at county fairs. Crowds paid to see mummies taller than any man alive. For a time, it seemed the giants were a part of history as real as the pyramids or Stonehenge. And then, silence. Skeletons carted away, museums that never displayed them, institutions that declared them hoaxes and destroyed them. The Smithsonian looms largest in this silence, accused of seizing bones only to erase them, of rewriting history to fit a cleaner narrative. Whether by accident, neglect, or intent, the result was the same. The most dramatic evidence vanished, leaving only fragments behind. In that absence, suspicion grew, until the giants became more than bones. They became symbols of suppression, evidence not only of a lost race but of a hidden truth. Science offered answers, but never enough to silence the echoes. DNA revealed that the Spirit Caveman was Native American, yet his skull remained strange, his burial older than the pyramids, his story unsettled. LiDAR revealed lost cities in the jungle, proving civilizations larger than once believed, but leaving open the question of who had first laid the stones. Ground-penetrating radar traced the chambers of unopened mounds, their secrets still sealed. Each advance in technology illuminated the past, but none erased the possibility that among the first peoples of the Americas, there had been others, taller, stronger, distinct. Meanwhile, the giants grew in culture, spreading into pulp paperbacks, sermons, documentaries, and internet forums. They were claimed as Nephilim, as fallen angels, as alien hybrids, as lost races deliberately erased. They became metaphors for suppressed truth, for the vastness of human potential, for the danger of forgetting. They were both feared and revered, mocked as fantasy, and embraced as proof. In this paradox, they achieved something bones alone could not. They became immortal in imagination. What do we make of them now? Are the giants of America only the shadows of exaggeration? the result of tall tales inflated by memory and myth? Are they rare cases of tall individuals transformed by awe into races of giants? Or were they truly another people, a branch of humanity now lost, buried beneath the soil and beneath the silence of those who could not accept their presence? The truth lies somewhere between memory and mystery, where history is never whole, where evidence vanishes but questions endure. The giants endure because they ask us to confront the fragility of what we call history. They remind us that the story we tell about ourselves is always incomplete, that bones can be hidden, that memory can be dismissed, that silence can erase as effectively as time. They force us to ask, what else has been forgotten? What else has been buried? What truths lie just beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for us to look, waiting for us to believe? Standing at Niagara Falls, Abraham Lincoln looked upon the cascade and imagined the eyes of giants who had gazed upon it long before. Today, we can do the same. We can stand on the mounds of Ohio, at the mouth of Lovelock Cave, in the deserts of Nevada, and imagine the shadows of men taller than ourselves, striding across the landscape, leaving behind bones that the soil could not hold forever. Whether they were myth or memory, they are still with us, larger than life, larger than silence. And perhaps that is the final truth. The giants of America may never be proven in a way that satisfies science, but they are proven in another way, by their persistence, by the refusal of their story to die, by the way they live in the convergence of memory, myth, and mystery. They endure not because they are displayed in museums, but because they walk in the imagination, in the stories of tribes, in the whispers of the land. They endure because every time the earth is broken and something strange is found, we remember them again. In the end, the giants leave us not with certainty, but with wonder, and perhaps that is their greatest gift. They remind us that history is not a closed book, but a living landscape, filled with echoes we have yet to understand. They remind us that the world is larger than we think, that the past is deeper than we know, that truth is not always what survives in glass cases, but what endures in silence, waiting for us to listen. The giants are gone, or hidden, or forgotten, but they are not lost. They are here, in the mounds, in the caves, in the rivers and valleys that bear their names. They are here, in the voices that still tell their stories. And as long as we walk this land, they will walk with us, unseen but not absent, reminders that we share the earth not only with those alive today, but with those who walked before. Too large to forget, too inconvenient to remember.